She was 23 years old, an orphan, and about to lose everything her father spent 30 years building. The banker smiled like a man who had already won. The deputy's hand rested on his gun, and Eliza had no way out until a dusty stranger swung off his horse and did something no one expected. Something that would cost him everything he had saved, for a woman he had never spoken to in his life. Why would a man do that? Keep listening, because the answer will surprise you. This is a channel dedicated to the heart of the American frontier cowboy stories, prairie love, the courage of mothers, and the quiet grace of strangers who show up exactly when they're needed most. This story is proof that a single act of generosity, given freely and without condition, can rewrite someone's entire future. Like this video, share it with a friend, leave your city in the comments, and subscribe so you never miss a story that reminds you what people are truly capable of.
That morning had started out like any other kind of bad dream. Eliza Hartley was standing by her kitchen window, looking out. Her father's coffee cup was still on the shelf where he'd left it 6 months back. A small ring of dust had gathered round its bottom, like a little headstone marking his absence. Outside, the New Mexico sun was already cooking the land, so dry it was starting to crack like an old saddle. The well was getting dangerously low. The cattle were looking thin, and the bank's letter, the third one, was laying on the table behind her. She knew its words by heart, even though she'd only read it the one time. Final notice. The amount due was $2,300. If payment was not made by October 15th, they would seize the property and all assets immediately. October 15th, that was today. She knew it was coming. She could feel it on the wind, like a big old dust storm you can see for miles but just can't outrun. For 4 long months, she had scraped and fought for every penny. She sold off anything that wasn't bolted down and worked her hands until they were raw, trying to keep that ranch afloat and make a payment the bank would take, but it just wasn't ever enough. The drought made sure of that. Then there was the cattle sickness that came through in August, and the simple fact that she was a 23-year-old woman, all by herself in a territory that didn't pay much mind to youth or women when it came to land and money. Her father, Thomas Hartley, he had built this place up from nothing over 30 years. He had carved a life right out of the stubborn dirt, and he raised horses that were famous 3 territories over for their heart and their grit. He had lived through Apache raids, terrible droughts, and blizzards that could kill a whole herd of cattle in one night. He survived all of that, only to be taken by a simple, dumb accident. A spooked horse and a rock in the wrong place had crushed his skull last March. And her mother, Sarah Hartley, she followed her husband into the good earth just 2 months later. It seemed her heart just gave up, not wanting to be in a world where he wasn't. And that left Eliza all alone, an orphan who inherited not just a ranch, but a big debt her father had taken on to grow his horse breeding business. It was a big gamble, one that would have paid off something wonderful if he had just lived long enough to see it through. But he hadn't. The sound of wagon wheels crunching over the dry road snapped her out of her thoughts. Her stomach felt like it dropped right down a deep well. They were here. 2 carriages, black as a funeral procession, with the seal of the Territorial Bank painted right on their doors. She watched them roll up the long drive, kicking up clouds of dust behind them like they were angry. 4 men climbed on out, 3 of them she'd never seen before, all dressed up in city suits that looked ridiculous in the heat. And 1 man she knew all too well, Vernon Hastings, the bank manager. He was a man whose smile never quite made it to his eyes, and shaking his hand always felt like touching something cold and dead. Eliza took a deep breath, pulled her shoulders back, and walked out onto that porch. The heat hit her like a solid wall, even though it wasn't even 9 o'clock in the morning yet. The wooden boards under her boots, boards her own father had put down, they creaked with a sound that sounded an awful lot like grieving. She stood right there at the top of the steps and just waited, clasping her hands together in front of her so they wouldn't start shaking. Hastings walked up first, taking off his hat in a way that might have looked polite if it wasn't for the hungry look in his eyes. "Miss Hartley," he said, and his voice carried across the yard with that fake kind of sympathy folks use right before they tear your life apart. "I'm sorry it's come to this." "Are you now?" Eliza heard herself say. Her voice sounded a lot steadier than she felt. For a second, something flickered across Hastings' face. Maybe he was annoyed, or maybe he was just amused. "The bank gave you every chance to settle this debt. Your father was a good customer for many years. We gave him credit because we trusted him." "My father died trying to build something," Eliza said. "I've just been trying to finish what he started." "With what money?" Hastings asked, spreading his hands. "Miss Hartley, you are 4 months behind. The total amount you owe, with interest and all the fees, is now $2,300. Do you have that money?" The question just hung there in the hot air like a hangman's noose. "You know I don't," Eliza said, her voice quiet. "Well then, I'm afraid we have no other choice but to begin the foreclosure," Hastings said. He motioned to the men behind him. "Mr. Pembroke here is our appraiser. He'll be making a list of the property and assets for the auction. I'm going to need you to be off the property by sundown." Those words felt like they hit her in the chest. Off the property by sundown. This was the house where she was born, where her mother taught her how to read, where her father told her stories by the fire about the old days, about building something that would last. And all of it would be gone by dark. "This is my home," Eliza said, and she hated how her voice sounded so small. "This is collateral," Hastings corrected her. "And as of this morning, it belongs to the Territorial Bank." One of the other men, Pembroke, she guessed, was already pulling out a big leather book and a pencil. He started looking around the place with the kind of bored look of a man counting furniture in a storage shed. The third man, who was younger and had a deputy's badge on his vest, just stood there with his hand resting on his pistol, like he thought Eliza might get violent all of a sudden. "The horses," she said quickly. "At least let me keep the horses. They aren't really part of the ranch. They're my breeding stock. My father kept separate records for the horse business." Hastings smiled, and that was worse than if he had frowned. "Everything on this property is collateral, Miss Hartley. The horses, the cattle, the equipment. All of it will be sold at auction to pay off the debt. If there's any money left over after the bank gets back what it's owed, you'll get it. Though I wouldn't hold my breath expecting much." Of course there wouldn't be. The bank would see to that. They would lowball the value of everything, sell it all to their buddies for next to nothing, and she'd be left with not a single dime, not even enough for a train ticket back east. Eliza felt something inside her just break. That last little bit of hope she'd been holding on to finally shattered into a million pieces. How much time do I have?" she asked. Hastings explained that Mr. Pembroke's valuation would likely take 3, maybe 4 hours. "I will need you here on the property that whole time in case he has questions. After that," he shrugged, "I'd suggest you gather what personal items you can carry and find somewhere else to stay. The ranch house itself will be locked up tight." "And just where am I supposed to go?" "Miss Hartley, that's not the bank's problem." The casual meanness of it just about knocked the wind out of her. She had known Vernon Hastings for years, seen him at church picnics and the 4th of July parades in town. Her own daddy had played cards with the man. Now here he stood on her land, taking her life apart piece by piece, and he couldn't even bother to act like he cared. Pembroke was already heading for the barn, his ledger book open, scribbling notes. The deputy stayed by the buggies, looking at Eliza with the tired eyes of a man who had seen this show before and knew he would see it again. "I'll need to get inside the house," Hastings said, "to take inventory of what's inside." Eliza wanted to tell him to go straight to hell. She wanted to slam the door in his face, bolt it shut, and dare them to kick it in. But that would only make the deputy draw his pistol, and then she wouldn't even have until sunset. They would haul her to jail, and the end result would be the very same. So she stepped out of the way. Hastings stomped up the porch steps, his boots sounding heavy on the wooden planks. He stopped at the door and glanced back at her. "For what it is worth," he said, I did try to talk the board into giving you more time. But you are a young single woman with no menfolk to speak for you. The bank simply cannot keep carrying accounts that do not turn a profit. How mighty big of you to try, Eliza said, her voice flat. Hastings's smile got tight. Being bitter is not going to help your circumstances, Miss Hartley. He stepped inside. Through the open door, Eliza could hear him rummaging around in her house. Her house. Opening drawers, scratching notes, cataloging her whole life like it was nothing more than goods on a general store shelf. She stood there on the porch, frozen by a sadness so big it had no place to go. All around her, the ranch that had been her entire world was slowly dying. The windmill that needed fixing groaned in the hot wind. The fence along the east pasture leaned over where the posts had rotted through. The garden her mama had so lovingly tended was now just a square of brown weeds. Everything her father had built, everything he had died fighting to keep, was gone. Far off, she saw Pembroke disappear into the barn. She knew exactly what he would find in there. 8 horses, 2 of them mares about to foal, and Ranger, the stallion her daddy had paid a fortune for 3 years back. They were magnificent creatures, every last one. They would be sold off one by one, probably to folks who knew nothing about how to properly care for a fine horse. The breeding line her father had spent decades creating would be scattered to the 4 winds. Eliza squeezed her eyes shut and tried to draw a breath past the tightness in her chest. So this was how it all ended. Not with a bang, but with paperwork and lists and polite men in suits taking everything apart. Her father's whole legacy was now just words in a ledger. A noise from inside made her open her eyes. A creak that told her Hastings was in her father's study, going through his desk. She knew she ought to be in there making sure he did not pocket anything, but she just could not make herself watch it. She could not stand the thought of some stranger's hands on her daddy's things. Instead, she walked down the porch steps and into the yard. She had to move, had to do something besides just stand there and let it all happen. The sun was climbing, promising another blistering day. October in New Mexico was supposed to be a relief from the summer blaze. But this year, the drought held on like a stubborn dog with a bone. The sky was a hard, pale blue, without a single cloud. There was no rain coming, just like there had not been for months. And there was no help coming now, either. Eliza found herself walking toward the little family cemetery, a small patch of ground on a hill overlooking the ranch, surrounded by a wrought iron fence her father had a blacksmith in Santa Fe make. Her mother and father were buried there side by side under identical headstones. Thomas Hartley, 1821 to 1886. Sarah Hartley, 1825 to 1886. She stood before their graves and wondered what they would think of all this. Would her father be ashamed she had failed to save his ranch? Would her mother tell her that she had done all she could? "I am so sorry," Eliza whispered to the silent stones. "I tried. I truly did." The wind blew hot and dry, kicking up dust across the little hill. In the distance she could hear Hastings yelling to Pembroke, their voices carrying clear across the empty land as they listed and counted and destroyed. She had no idea how long she stood there. Time had gotten strange, stretching and shrinking. It felt like hours had passed and no time at all. The sun beat down on her head. Sweat ran down her back. Her throat was bone dry. But the idea of going back to the house for a drink of water, her house that was about to belong to someone else, was just too much to bear. Finally, Hastings' voice broke through her daze. "Miss Hartley, I need you back at the house." She turned and saw him on the porch, waving his arm for her to hurry. With heavy feet, she walked back down the hill. As she got closer, she saw that Pembroke was back from the barn, his ledger book now full of scribbled notes. The deputy had moved into the shade of a carriage, his hat pulled down low over his eyes. "I need your signature on these papers," Hastings said, shoving a stack of documents at her. They are to acknowledge that you have received the foreclosure notice and to confirm the inventory. Eliza stared at the papers, but the words were a blur. And if I refuse to sign? Then the deputy will make a note of your refusal, and the foreclosure will happen anyway. Your signature is a courtesy, Miss Hartley, not a requirement. Of course it was. She took the papers and the pencil Hastings held out. Her hand was shaking as she wrote her name, Eliza Jane Hartley, on the lines he pointed to. Each time she signed, it felt like a little piece of her died. There, Hastings said with a satisfied tone, snatching the papers back. That is all settled. Mr. Pembroke, what is your final assessment? My preliminary figures show the total value of the assets to be around $1,800, Pembroke said in a whiny voice, taking into account the condition of the buildings, the livestock, and the current market. $1,800. For a ranch her daddy spent 30 years of his life building. For horses that were worth twice that amount if sold right. For a house that had been home to 3 generations of her family. That will barely cover the main debt, Hastings said with a frown. What about the horses specifically? The breeding animal should fetch a high price. Not in this market, Pembroke said. The drought has hurt everyone. Nobody is buying fancy things like thoroughbred horses when they can barely afford to feed the animals they already have. Fancy things, that is what he called her father's life's work. Well, we will just have to get what we can, Hastings said. He turned back to Eliza. The auction is set for next Saturday in town. You are welcome to come, although I doubt it would be very pleasant for you. How thoughtful of you, Eliza said, her voice empty. Hastings pulled out his pocket watch. It is almost noon. I believe our business here is done, Miss Hartley. You have until sundown to gather your personal belongings. Anything still here after that becomes the property of the bank. 6 hours. She had 6 hours to go through 23 years of her life and figure out what she could carry. I will need a wagon, she said, to move my things. I am afraid the wagon is part of the ranch's assets, Hastings said. It has already been inventoried. Then how am I supposed to? You could hire a wagon in town, or maybe one of your neighbors might be willing to lend a hand. His voice made it clear he did not think that was likely. Around here, helping someone the bank was putting out was a good way to get on the bad side of the very men who held everyone's loans. Eliza felt hot tears welling up and she blinked them back hard. She would not cry in front of these men. She would not give them the satisfaction. Is there anything else? She asked. I will need the keys to the house before I go. The house is not locked. It will be. The bank will have new locks put on tomorrow. Hastings held his hand out, waiting. Eliza almost laughed at how ridiculous it was. She had never locked her doors a day in her life. Nobody out here did. But now the bank needed keys. They wanted to seal up her home like a coffin. I do not have any keys, she said. We never needed them. Hastings let out a sigh like this was a great personal bother to him. Then I will have a locksmith come today. You will need to be done removing your things in the next few hours. Before she could answer, a new sound cut through the hot, quiet air. It was the sound of hoofbeats coming fast. They all turned to look down the road. A lone rider was coming, pushing his horse hard, a cloud of dust rising up behind him like smoke. Even from far away, Eliza could tell he was a tall man with broad shoulders, wearing the kind of dusty coat that belonged to someone who spent more time on the trail than in town. The rider did not slow down as he got closer. If anything, he spurred his horse on, thundering down the last bit of road before pulling back hard on the reins, stopping in a spray of dirt and gravel. The horse, a powerful buckskin, sidestepped and snorted as the man swung down from the saddle like he had done it 1,000 times. He was younger than Eliza first thought, maybe in his early 30s, with skin darkened by the sun and eyes the color of a thunderhead. His jaw was covered in a few days of stubble, and his clothes, while dusty, were well made. A gun belt hung low on his hips, the leather of the holster worn smooth from years of use. "Well now," Hastings said, getting his composure back. "Can I help you, sir?" The stranger paid him no mind. His eyes had already found Eliza, and there was something in the way he looked at her. A glimmer of recognition, a touch of concern that made her breath catch in her throat. "Are you Eliza Hartley?" he asked. His voice was deep, carrying the soft edges of a man who grew up speaking Spanish before he learned English. "I am," she said, her mind racing with confusion. "Do I know you?" "No, ma'am, but I know who you are. I've seen you in town." He glanced around at the fancy carriages from Hastings and Pembroke, then at the deputy, and his jaw set hard. "Is this a foreclosure?" "That is not your affair," Hastings said, all stiff and proper. "This is bank business." "Well, I am making it my business." The stranger's hand came to rest near his gun belt. It was not a threat, just a simple fact you could not ignore. "Miss Hartley, are these men taking your ranch?" Eliza finally found her voice. "Yes, I owe the bank some money. $2,300. I just do not have it." The stranger's eyes, she could see them now. They were gray like a winter rain, and they moved over her face, studying her with a focus that should have felt wrong, but somehow it did not. $2,300, he repeated, his voice low. "That is the total amount, plus fees and interest that will continue to accrue," Hastings chimed in. "Now, I do not believe I got your name." "Mercer," the stranger said. "Caleb Mercer." He turned back to Eliza. "Ma'am, if you had the money right this second, would that stop all this? Would they leave?" "Well, yes, but—" "How much exactly?" Caleb cut in, looking straight at Hastings. The bank manager's face had become a careful blank mask. "As I said, $2,300 plus." "I heard you the first time," Caleb said. "If I pay you that full amount right now, do these men get off this land and this woman keeps her ranch?" A stunned silence settled over the dusty yard. Hastings was the first to find his tongue. "Well, yes, if the debt were paid in full, the foreclosure would be suspended, but Mr. Mercer, I should tell you that—" "I am not asking for a history lesson," Caleb said flatly. "I am asking if you take the payment right now, do you leave?" "Yes," Hastings said, and Eliza could hear the disbelief heavy in his voice. "But Mr. Mercer, $2,300 is not a small sum." "I hardly think—" Caleb Mercer was already reaching into his saddlebag. Eliza just stood there, frozen, as he pulled out not one but two thick leather pouches. They both made a heavy clinking sound as he moved. He walked right past Hastings, over to where Pembroke stood with his ledger book, and he dumped the contents of the first pouch right onto the carriage's running board. A river of gold coins spilled out, glittering and winking in the sunlight. "Start counting," Caleb said. Pembroke just stared at the money like he had never seen a coin in his life. Hastings pushed him aside, his eyes wide as dinner plates. "This is— Where did you get this?" "None of your concern," Caleb said, throwing Hastings' own words right back at him. "It is good money, is it not? So count it." With hands that shook just a little, Pembroke began sorting the coins into neat stacks. Eliza watched, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. This could not be real. This stranger, this man she had never laid eyes on before, could not possibly be paying off her entire debt. Things like this just did not happen, not to her, not on a day like this. But the coins kept clinking as Pembroke counted, his lips moving without a sound. 1,000, he announced at last. Caleb emptied the second pouch. More gold coins joined the first shiny pile. 2,000. A third, smaller pouch appeared. 2,200. Caleb then reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a handful of silver dollars. "That ought to cover the rest and whatever fees you have tacked on." The final count came to $2,350. Hastings stared at the money pile like it had personally insulted him. "Mr. Mercer, I must tell you that this is highly unusual. to take on another person's debt without proper legal advice. I do not need legal advice, Caleb said. You said if the debt is paid, you leave. It is paid, so leave. There are procedures, so then follow them. Write up whatever papers you need to write, but you will be doing it with her debt paid in full, which means this foreclosure is finished. Is that not right? Hastings' mouth opened and closed for a moment like a fish out of water. Finally, he choked out, "Yes, if the debt is paid in full, the foreclosure is suspended. But, Mr. Mercer, you must understand that by paying Miss Hartley's debt, you do not get any claim to this property. The debt would simply be transferred." "I understand how debt works," Caleb cut him off. "Write up your papers saying it has been paid. Miss Hartley and I will sort out the rest between ourselves." Eliza finally found her voice. I do not understand what is happening." Caleb turned to her, and for the first time since he had ridden up, his hard expression softened just a little. "What is happening is these men are leaving, and you are keeping your ranch." "But why? You do not even know who I am." "No, ma'am," he agreed. "But I know what it feels like to watch someone lose everything they have to men who do not give a damn. And I know I have money I have been saving for a piece of land. Seems to me this land is worth saving." It was crazy. It was impossible. And yet it was happening right in front of her. Hastings, who could see this whole situation had gotten away from him, started gathering up the money with Pembroke's help, counting it all over again just to be sure. The deputy had stood up straight, his hand now far from his gun, just watching the whole thing unfold with a look of pure confusion. "I will need a receipt," Caleb said, his voice firm, "written and signed, stating that the debt of $2,300 owed by Miss Eliza Hartley to the Territorial Bank has been paid in full on this date, October 15th, 1886. "I will have to draw up the official documents back at the bank," Hastings protested. "Then you will bring them here tomorrow, but I want a signed receipt today before you leave this property." Hastings' jaw clenched tight, but he pulled out a piece of paper and started to write. The scratching of his pen sounded way too loud in the quiet yard. When he was done, he shoved the paper at Caleb with a barely hidden scowl. Caleb took his time reading it over before he folded it neatly and tucked it into his pocket. "Pleasure doing business with you," he said, and his tone made it clear it had been anything but. Hastings turned to Eliza. "Miss Hartley, you should know that while your debt today has been taken care of, you now owe this money to Mr. Mercer. I strongly advise you to speak with a lawyer about the terms of repayment." "She will handle her own business the way she wants to," Caleb said before Eliza could even think of a reply. "Now, I believe you gentlemen were on your way out." It was not a question. Hastings looked like he wanted to argue some more, but one look at Caleb Mercer standing there, as calm and solid as a rock, seemed to make him change his mind. He gave a sharp nod to Pembroke and the deputy. "Pack up the ledgers. We are finished here." The three men climbed back into their carriages, looking a whole lot less confident than when they had arrived. As the driver got ready to leave, Hastings leaned out the window. "I will be back tomorrow with the official documents," he said. "Looking forward to it," Caleb replied. Eliza just stood there like a statue as the carriages rolled back down the road, kicking up dust behind them. She watched until they were just a speck around the bend, until even the sound of their wheels had faded away. Then she turned to the man who had just saved her world. Caleb Mercer stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt, watching her with those stormy gray eyes. His horse, forgotten during all the trouble, had wandered over to the water trough and was drinking like it had been a long day. "I do not understand," Eliza said again, her voice barely a whisper. "Why would you do that? You just paid $2,300 for what?" "For the chance to make you an offer," Caleb said. "If you are willing to listen." "An offer?" "Yes, ma'am. But first, maybe we ought to talk about this somewhere out of the sun. I have been writing since dawn, and I reckon you have had a harder morning than you were planning on." Eliza looked back at her house. Her house, that was still her house by some miracle, and felt tears starting to well up again. But this time they were not just from sadness. "Yes," she said. "Yes, let us go inside." She led him up the porch steps, her legs feeling shaky, and her mind still spinning. Behind them, Caleb's horse finished its drink and started to nibble at the few sad patches of grass left in the yard. The house was just as she had left it, or rather, as Hastings had left it, with drawers pulled halfway out and papers scattered where he had been taking inventory. She felt a hot flush of embarrassment at the mess, the poverty of it all laid bare for a stranger to see. But Caleb did not seem to notice. He just took off his hat as he stepped through the door, waiting for her to tell him where to go. "The kitchen," Eliza heard herself say. "I can make some coffee." "That would be model. I appreciate it, ma'am." She went about the familiar task, working the pump handle for water, scooping the coffee grounds, and tending to the fire inside the stove. Her hands were unsteady, but the work gave them a purpose. From behind, she heard the old kitchen chair groan as Caleb took a seat at the table. "You mentioned you had seen me in town," Eliza said, keeping her back to him. "When was that?" "A few times, over this past year," Caleb replied. "You were mostly coming in for supplies. I saw you once at the feed store when I was selling a horse to the owner, and another time at the church picnic last 4th of July. Eliza had a faint recollection of that day. It was one of the last times she had felt anything close to normal before the weight of her troubles had settled in for good. She sure did not remember seeing him, though. "I did not even notice you," she confessed to herself. "Most folks don't. I try not to draw much attention." The coffee started to brew. Eliza reached for 2 cups, her father's and her mother's, the ones with the little blue flowers, and placed them on the table. "You said you had a proposition for me," she said, at last turning to face him. In the light of the kitchen, Caleb Mercer seemed older, the lines etched around his eyes deeper than they had appeared outside. But his look was unwavering and honest. "I do, but first I have a question for you. Do you truly want to hold on to this ranch?" "Of course I do," Eliza answered without a second thought. "This is my home. My father built this place. He died defending it. But is it that you want to run it, or do you just want to keep it because it belongs to you?" The question took her by surprise. "I reckon it's both. I know how to run this place. My daddy taught me everything there is to know. I can work the horses, I can manage the breeding, the debt, the drought, and the fact that you will be 4 months behind on payments again come February unless a change comes." The plain truth of his words felt like a physical blow. "I will manage. I will just have to work harder. I will sell more horses." "And what breeding stock will you use?" Caleb asked softly. "Pardon me for being so blunt, ma'am, but I had a look in your barn when I rode in. You are down to 8 horses, and only 2 of them are expecting. That is not nearly enough to run a breeding business that turns a profit. Not in these times. Your father, he might have had the money and the right connections to make a go of it. You do not. Not right now." Eliza dropped into the chair on the other side of the table. "So, what are you telling me? That I ought to just give it all up? No, I am saying you need a helping hand, and I am here to offer it." The coffee pot let out a whistle. Eliza stood up like she was in a trance, poured 2 cups, and put one down in front of Caleb. The simple, everyday action felt completely out of place. "What kind of help are you talking about?" she asked. Caleb cupped his hands around the warm mug, but did not take a drink. "I have been driving cattle for 12 years, he said. "I started at 18, working for outfits down in Texas and up in Colorado. I spent every single season on the trail. I saved every last dollar I earned. I have been searching for a piece of land to buy, a place to start my own operation. But good land is mighty hard to find. And when you do find it, there is always somebody with deeper pockets or better friends who gets to it first." "So you are looking to buy my ranch?" "No," Caleb said, his eyes meeting hers. "I want to be your partner, a real legal partner. A 50-50 ownership. I will put up the capital I have been saving. There is a good deal more where that $2,300 came from. You put up the land, the horses you have now, and your knowledge of horse breeding. We will run this ranch together. We will share the profits. We will share the risk. And we will share the work. Eliza just stared at him. You want to go into business with a woman you just met. I know you did not quit when you lost your folks. I know you have been fighting for 4 months straight to save this place. I know you faced down those men from the bank even when you had nothing to fight with. He took a breath. And I know you love this ranch enough to work yourself to death trying to keep it. That tells me everything I need to know. But why? Why not just bide your time until the next foreclosure? You could buy up somebody's land for a song. Because that is not the man I am, Caleb said plainly. I had to watch my own mother lose her farm after my father passed. I watched the bank take it all while our neighbors just stood by saying how sorry they were but not lifting a finger. I made a promise to myself that if I ever got the chance, I would never just stand by and watch that happen to somebody else. Not if I could do something to stop it. Eliza felt a lump forming in her throat. I cannot pay you back. Not $2,300. That would take me years. I am not asking you to pay me back. I am asking you to build something with me. If we succeed, we both make out well. If we fail, we both lose. That is the meaning of a partnership. It was a crazy idea, completely absurd. Starting a business with a stranger, signing away half the ownership of her father's ranch to a man she had known for all of 30 minutes. And yet she heard herself ask, what about the cattle? You said you drove cattle. I do not know the first thing about a cattle operation. And I do not know much about horse breeding past the basics, Caleb said. But put us together, and we would have both sides covered. I can bring in cattle. You can build up the horse business. This ranch has good access to water, even with the drought. That arroyo is fed by a deep spring. If we manage the herd right, we could run a decent-sized cattle operation right alongside your horses. The bank told me the horses were not worth much in this market. The bank was trying to get them for next to nothing. Your stock is worth a whole lot to the right people, and I know those people from my years on the cattle trails. I am talking about ranchers who need good, solid working horses and will pay a top price for animals that come from a proven line. Eliza's thoughts were spinning. How would this work with the law? How can I be sure you will not just take everything over once we are partners? We will have proper papers drawn up, 50-50 ownership, with an equal voice in every decision we make. We can ride into town tomorrow, see a lawyer, and make it all official. If you want to add clauses in there to protect your share, we will put them in. This is not a handout, Miss Hartley. It is a business deal. I need land and a going concern to put my money into. You need cash and another strong back around here. We both need this to succeed. Why both horses and cattle? Why not just focus on one or the other? It is about diversification. Your father was a smart man to get into horse breeding, but he had all his eggs in one basket. When the drought came and the cattle market went south, all of a sudden no one was buying high-dollar horses. But if you have both operations going, one can keep you afloat when the other one is in trouble. It is just basic sense for managing risk. He was right, and Eliza knew he was. She had had the same thought herself these past few months, as she watched her father's well-laid plans fall apart because they were tied to a single market. "And you would live here?" she asked. "On the ranch?" "Well, I cannot very well run an operation from town. I would need to be here. People would talk. Let them talk. We would be business partners, not—" He trailed off, and for the first time Eliza saw a hint of a blush on his cheeks. It would all be proper. "I can sleep in the barn, or we can put up a small bunkhouse. Whatever you think is right." Eliza looked into her coffee cup, her mind in a whirlwind. This man had just stepped in and kept her from losing everything she had in the world. He was offering her a lifeline, a chance to do more than just get by, but maybe even to prosper. But saying yes meant changing everything about her connection to her father's ranch. It meant admitting she could not save it on her own. "Can I have some time to think on it?" she asked in a low voice. "Of course, you take all the time you need." Caleb waited a moment. "Well, maybe not all the time. The debt is settled for now, but winter is on its way. We will need to make some choices about the stock, about ordering feed, and about repairs that need doing. The longer we put it off, the tougher it will be." "How long have you been thinking about this?" Eliza asked, a sudden thought striking her. Caleb had the good sense to look a little embarrassed. "About 2 months now. It was when I heard in town that you had fallen behind on your payments. I started asking around, learned about your predicament. I thought about coming to you sooner, but—" he gave a little shrug. "It felt a bit forward to offer help before it was truly needed. And you just happened to ride up today of all days. I knew the date of the foreclosure. It was not too hard to figure out the right time to show up. That was a mighty big gamble. What if I had already lost the ranch by the time you arrived? Then I would have bought it at the auction and offered you a job as my foreman," Caleb said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Either way, it just seemed wrong to let good land and a fine horse operation go to ruin." Eliza was not sure if she should be impressed by his straight-ahead logic or a little unnerved by it. "I need to see your capital," she said. "If we are going to be partners, I need to know what you are bringing to the table besides the money you just used to pay off my debt." "That is fair," Caleb said as he stood up. "I have all the papers in my saddlebag, bank statements, letters of credit, and a list of the livestock I own that is currently up with a cattle outfit in Colorado. It should give you a clear picture, a better idea of things." They stepped back out into the yard. The sun was well past its peak, starting that long, slow journey toward evening. Caleb's horse had found a little patch of shade and was resting half asleep on 3 legs. Caleb went to his saddlebag and pulled out a leather folder. Inside, he had papers all laid out neat and tidy. There were bank statements from Denver and Santa Fe, letters from cattle bosses confirming he owned breeding bulls and several hundred head of mixed stock. He even had a letter of recommendation from a Colorado rancher whose name Eliza knew. She read every single word, twice. The amount of money just about made her head spin. After settling her debt, Caleb Mercer would still have close to $4,000 in cash, plus livestock worth at least that much all over again. She finally looked up. "You've been putting this away for a good while," she said. "Since I was 18. Every dollar that I didn't need to live on went straight to the bank. I figured one day I'd have enough to buy my own land. But like I told you, good land is mighty hard to find. And you're really willing to gamble all this on a partnership with a stranger." "I'm willing to gamble on someone who has proven she's not a quitter," Caleb corrected her gently. "Sometimes that counts for more than experience." Eliza handed the folder back to him. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. This was either the smartest move she would ever make, or the dumbest, and there was no way to know which until it was far too late. "If we're going to do this," she said slowly, "we need to have rules, some clear lines." "I agree. I get the final word on anything to do with the horses. That means breeding, selling, and training. That was my daddy's side of things, and now it's mine." "Fair enough. And I get the final word on the cattle. But for anything that touches the whole ranch, like big purchases, fixing up the land, or hiring help, we have to decide together. And what happens if we don't see eye to eye? Then we sit and talk it out until we can find a way forward. And if we get truly stuck, we bring in somebody else to help us sort it out. Maybe the lawyer, or someone else we both can trust." It was a good plan, more than fair. But Eliza still felt like she was standing on a cliff's edge, about to take a leap of faith. "I have one more question," she said. "Why are you not married? Why are you way out here by yourself, instead of building a family ranch with a wife?" A shadow seemed to cross Caleb's face for just a second. "I was engaged one time about 5 years back. She decided she didn't want to be a wife to a man who was gone 8 months of the year on cattle drives. Can't say I hold it against her. This kind of life isn't for just anybody." And you never found someone else? I've spent the last 5 years saving up and learning this business. It just did not seem right to ask a woman to put her life on hold while I was still trying to build mine. He paused for a moment. What about you? You are young and more than capable. How come there is not a husband here helping you run this place? Because the kind of men who came courting wanted a wife, not a partner in business, Eliza said, her voice flat. They wanted a woman to cook their meals, keep their house clean, and give them children while they ran the ranch. My daddy taught me how to manage the operations, how to understand a contract, and how to breed good horses. Most men found that more scary than appealing. That is their loss, Caleb said. And he sounded like he truly meant every word of it. They just stood there in the yard with the afternoon heat bearing down on them. Two complete strangers thinking about tying their futures together. I need until tomorrow, Eliza said at last. I need to think this through properly to make sure I'm not just, she waved a hand in the air, acting out of panic after almost losing everything. That sounds wise, Caleb said with a nod. I will ride on into town, get a room for the night, and come back out in the morning. You can tell me your answer then. If you say yes, we will ride in together to see the lawyer. If you say no, he shrugged his shoulders. Well, the debt is still paid. You will have some room to breathe and figure out what to do next. And if I say no, you will just leave after spending $2,300? You can call it an investment in doing what is right, Caleb said. Sometimes, that just has to be good enough. He gathered up his horse's reins and swung up into the saddle like he was born there. Looking down at her, his face was serious, but there was a kindness in his eyes. Miss Hartley, I know this is a whole lot to take in at once, and I know you do not have any reason to trust me other than what I did for you today. But I want you to know, if we do this, I am all in. I do not back out of partnerships, and I do not give up on the land. Your father built something here that is worth saving. I would be honored to help you keep on building it. Before Eliza could even think of a reply, he tipped the brim of his hat and pointed his horse toward the road. She watched him ride off, the dust kicking up from his horse's hooves. She watched until he was just a small, dark speck way off in the distance, and then he was gone completely. Then she turned around and looked at her ranch. It was still hers, against all the odds. The barn was in need of new shingles on the roof. The fences needed mending in more places than she could count. The water pump was making a terrible grinding sound that meant something inside was about to break. The pastures were brown and dry from the lack of rain. And the cattle market was down, with winter and all its troubles just around the corner. But the ranch was still standing. It was still hers. The only question was whether it should stay only hers, or if taking on help, taking on a partner, was the smarter and braver thing to do. Eliza went back inside the house. Her father's old coffee cup was still sitting on the shelf, collecting dust. She picked it up, turning it over and over in her hands. "What would you do, Papa?" she whispered to the quiet room. But deep down, she already knew the answer. Her father had always been a practical man, above all else. He had partnered up with other ranchers when it made good sense. He had borrowed money when he needed it, and he had always hired good men and paid them a fair wage. He never let his pride stand in the way of doing what had to be done. Eliza put the cup down and walked into her father's study. The papers that Hastings had thrown around were still lying there. There were loan papers, breeding records, and letters from buyers in 3 different territories. She spent the rest of that afternoon putting them all back in order, reading through her father's notes. For the first time, she truly understood just how big the operation had been, and how it would be impossible for just one person to handle it all alone. As the sun went down, it painted the New Mexico sky with streaks of orange and deep red. Eliza stood on the porch and watched the land her father had loved so much fade into the twilight. Tomorrow, Caleb Mercer would be back, and tomorrow she would have an answer for him. Eliza was awake before the sun came up with her mind already made up. She could not say exactly when she had decided. Maybe it was when she was reading her father's detailed breeding records, seeing all the years of careful planning that she just could not let go to waste. Or maybe it was just the simple truth that Caleb Mercer had ridden into her life at the very moment she needed someone to save her. And turning him away now would not just be foolish, it would feel like turning her back on a blessing. She got dressed in her most sensible work clothes, a split riding skirt, and one of her father's old work shirts with the sleeves rolled up. She went out to see to the horses before the day got too hot. The morning air was cool, almost chilly, a little reminder that winter was coming whether she was ready for it or not. The stallion, Ranger, nickered when she came to his stall. She ran a hand down his strong neck, feeling the powerful muscles under his shiny coat that her father had been so proud of. "We are going to be all right," she told him in a soft voice. "I really think we are going to be all right." The horse just snorted and bumped her shoulder with his head, seeming more interested in his breakfast than her words of comfort. By the time she had fed and watered all 8 horses, the sun was just starting to peek over the horizon, washing the yard in a warm golden light. She was carrying water buckets back from the pump when she heard the sound of a horse on the road. Caleb Mercer rode in with the sunrise right behind him, looking like a picture from one of those adventure books. His horse moved with a steady, ground-eating walk that spoke of covering long distances, and Caleb sat in the saddle with a natural ease that told you he had spent most of his life on horseback. He pulled his horse to a stop near the porch, and his eyes met hers right away. "Morning, Miss Hartley." "Morning." Eliza set the water buckets down and wiped her hands on her skirt. "You are here early. I did not want to waste any daylight if you had made your decision." He stopped for a second, and she could see a little bit of tightness in his shoulders, even though his voice was calm. "Have you?" "I have." Eliza took a deep breath. "My answer is yes. I will accept your partnership offer." Something in Caleb's face changed then. Maybe it was relief, though he hid it pretty quick. He swung himself down from his horse and stood there facing her in the dusty yard. "You're sure about that?" he asked. "No second thoughts?" "Plenty of second thoughts," Eliza admitted. "But the first thought just keeps winning. I can't do all this by myself. And what you're offering is a fair deal. More than fair, really, seeing as how you already paid off the whole debt without even knowing if I'd agree." "Well then, we ought to head into town," Caleb said. "Get the legal papers drawn up before anything else has a chance to go wrong. Should I go saddle a horse?" "It might be easier if we took a wagon. We'll need to carry some documents, and there will be papers to bring back, unless your wagon was already—" "No," Eliza cut in. "Hastings was lying about that. The wagon is mine. I just didn't feel like arguing with him about every little thing." A small smile pulled at the corner of Caleb's mouth. "Smart, pick your battles." They hitched up Eliza's wagon, a good sturdy rig her daddy had built with his own 2 hands, and they started toward town. The ride was quiet for a bit. It seemed like neither one of them knew exactly how to act in this new situation. They weren't exactly strangers anymore, but they weren't quite partners yet either. They were just stuck in some kind of in-between place, and the silence felt a little heavier because of it. Finally, Caleb spoke up. "Tell me about the horses. Your breeding program. What was your father's vision?" Eliza glanced over at him, thankful he picked a safe topic. "He wanted to develop a line of horses that had the toughness of Mustang stock, but with the size and strength of thoroughbreds. He wanted working horses that could go all day in these hard conditions, but still have the speed and the right mind for ranch work. For 15 years he had poured his soul into it, choosing the bloodlines with a careful hand. Ranger, he was your foundation stallion." "Yes, sir." "Papa bought him from a man over in Kentucky. It cost him nearly every dime he had to his name back then. But he swore the moment he laid eyes on that horse, he knew. He said Ranger was built just like the horse he had been picturing in his dreams. And the mares, 3 of them, are daughters from our last stallion. Papa always kept the finest fillies from every new generation. 2 are Mustang crosses with real sturdy bones, and the 2 that are pregnant, They're the first generation of Rangers' foals. If they come out right, those babies will be the proof of what Papa was working so hard to build. Caleb was quiet for a second, taking it all in. When are they due? Late December, early January, right in the thick of the worst winter weather, of course. It's always that way, ain't it? He just shook his head. We will need to make sure that barn is sealed up tight. The last thing we need is a foal coming down with pneumonia. The easy way he said we sent a small shiver of hope through Eliza. It was real. This was really happening. What about your cattle? She asked. You said you have some stock up in Colorado. 300 head, a mixed herd, mostly Herefords, with some Longhorns mixed in for their toughness. They are with an outfit I worked for last season. The foreman is keeping them for me. I paid the winter grazing fees before I headed out. Come spring, I can either sell them off and use the money here, or we can drive them down to New Mexico if we have enough pasture for them. The Arroyo pasture could likely handle 100 head, Eliza said, thinking it over. Maybe more if we manage the grazing right, but 300, not all at once. We would sell off the ones we do not need. Just keep a core breeding group. Build it up nice and slow. The important thing is not to let them overgraze. That is how you kill the land, for good. They both fell quiet again. But it was a more comfortable quiet this time. That talk had put them on equal footing. Both of them bringing something to the table, both of them determined to make this whole thing work. The town of Socorro seemed to just rise up out of the dusty plains like you were imagining it. It was a cluster of adobe and wood buildings all gathered around a main plaza, with a church steeple reaching up over everything. Even this early, the streets were buzzing with merchants setting up their stalls, ranchers hauling in goods, and kids running errands before school started. Eliza could feel people's eyes on them as they drove into town. She knew exactly what they were seeing. A young woman and a strange man riding in a wagon together, looking like they knew each other well. The gossip would be flying all over town before noon. Let them talk. Caleb did not seem to notice the stares. His mind was set on finding the lawyer's office. They found it on a side street close to the courthouse, a little building with a sign that read Arthur Peyton, Attorney at Law. I hope he is not related to that assessor from the bank, Eliza mumbled. Different spelling, Caleb said, pointing. And even if he was, money tends to speak louder than family when it comes to the law. They tied up the wagon and stepped inside. The office was small but neat. Shelves were packed with law books, and the desk was buried under a mountain of papers. A man in his 50s glanced up from his work, with spectacles resting on the tip of his nose. Can I help you folks? We need to have some partnership papers drawn up, Caleb stated. Legal and binding for a ranching operation. Peyton's eyebrows went up just a bit. I see. And you are? Caleb Mercer. This here is Miss Eliza Hartley. She owns the Hartley Ranch, northeast of town. Ah, yes, I know the place. Your father was Thomas Hartley, was he not, the lawyer? Asked Eliza. He was, a good man. I was mighty sorry to hear he had passed. Peyton motioned toward the chairs in front of his desk. Please have a seat. Now, you are looking to form a business partnership for a ranch. What kind of an arrangement are you thinking about? For the next hour, they worked through all the details. 50-50 ownership, equal say in decisions within their own areas of skill, rules for sharing profits, handling arguments, and even ending the partnership if it came to that. Peyton asked some sharp questions, making good and sure that both of them understood what they were getting into. Miss Hartley, he said at one point, you realize that by going into this partnership, you are pretty much giving Mr. Mercer half ownership of a property that has been in your family for 3 decades. I do. And you are all right with this arrangement? Eliza looked the lawyer straight in the eye. Mr. Mercer paid off my debt yesterday, right when the bank was about to foreclose. Without him, I would have absolutely nothing. With him, I have a chance to keep my family's ranch going and make it profitable. Yes, I am all right with it. Peyton turned to Caleb. And you, sir, are investing a good deal of money into a property you have never worked, with a partner you hardly know. Does that seem like a wise business decision to you? It does, Caleb said plainly. I have looked into the property values, I have gone over the breeding records Miss Hartley showed me, and I have checked out the quality of the land myself. The basics are all solid. What it was missing was operating money and manpower, both of which I can supply. The lawyer looked at the two of them for a long moment, and then he just shrugged. Well, it is your future. I will get the papers drawn up. It will take me a few days to get it all written down properly and witnessed. In the meantime, I suggest you both think long and hard about what you are doing. Partnerships can be a wonderful thing or a complete disaster, and the difference usually comes down to how well the partners talk to each other. We will be fine, Eliza said with more certainty than she actually felt. They left the lawyer's office after agreeing with a handshake to come back in 3 days and sign the official papers. As they walked back toward the wagon, Caleb said, "We ought to stop at the general store. If we are going to start working this ranch the right way, we are going to need some supplies." "I do not have much cash on me," Eliza admitted. "I do. Just think of it as a down payment on our partnership costs." At the general store, they got even more stares. Mrs. Henderson, the owner's wife, looked like she was dying to ask them questions, but she settled for being overly polite instead. "Miss Hartley, how wonderful it is to see you." "And Mr. Mercer," Caleb answered. "Ma'am?" They bought supplies for fencing, nails, oil for the lamps, coffee, flour, salt, pork, and beans, all the essentials for ranch living. Caleb also picked up a new axe and a coil of good, strong rope. Eliza added some fabric for new winter curtains, feeling strangely like she was setting up a home. As they were loading all the supplies into the wagon, a familiar voice called out, "Eliza Hartley, is that you?" Eliza turned and saw Margaret Sullivan walking toward them, a woman her own age that she had known since they were children. Margaret's eyes were shining with curiosity. "Maggie," Eliza said, forcing herself to smile, "it is good to see you." "You too. I heard the strangest rumor yesterday. Something about the bank trying to take your ranch." "They did try," Eliza said in a steady voice. "The debt has been paid." "Well, thank the good Lord. But how in the world did you—" Margaret's eyes slid right over to Caleb, who was standing there beside the wagon. "Oh, I see." Eliza could feel the wrong ideas taking root in her mind. "Maggie, this here is Caleb Mercer. He is going to be my business partner. We are running this ranch together." Business partner. The way Margaret said it, you would think it was a dirty word. "Well, aren't you just the modern woman?" "It is a legitimate partnership," Eliza said, her voice getting a little chilly. "We are having legal papers drawn up. Of course, of course. I am sure it is all on the up and up." Margaret gave a smile that said she was not sure of any such thing. "Well, I have to be getting along. Mother is waiting for me at the dressmaker's. But we simply must have tea soon, Eliza. I am just dying to hear all about your new little arrangement." She swept away in a cloud of fabric, already scanning the street for the next person to tell. "Well now," Caleb said in a dry tone, "that went about how I figured." "This is how it is going to be for a while," Eliza said, feeling the heat creep up her neck. "Folks are going to talk. They will make assumptions. Let them assume. We know the truth of it, and that is all that counts." Caleb pulled himself up onto the wagon seat. "Besides, once they get a look at how hard we are working and how proper this operation is, they will find somebody else to gossip about." Eliza surely hoped he was right, but she had her doubts. Small towns have long memories, and they sure do love a good scandal. They headed back toward the ranch, the wagon groaning under the weight of all their supplies. About halfway home, Caleb finally spoke up. "I have been giving some thought to the living situation." Eliza's stomach knotted up. "Yes, the barn is all right for now, but it will not be very comfortable when winter rolls in. And if we are going to make this partnership work for the long haul, I will need some proper quarters. I am thinking we could add a room onto the house. It would have a separate entrance and its own stove for heat. It would cost a little, but it would be a fine investment." "That sounds sensible," Eliza said, feeling relieved he was being so practical about it. "Or," Caleb went on, "if you would feel better with more distance between us, I could build a small cabin down near the barn. It would take longer, but it would give us both a bit more privacy." "The addition makes more sense," Eliza decided. "The house is built solid, and we would save money on materials. Besides, with 2 people working this ranch, it would be good to have someone close by in case of an emergency." "Fair point. I will get started on it next week as soon as we get those partnership papers signed." They fell quiet again, but Eliza's thoughts were spinning. She was about to share her home, not just her ranch, but the very roof over her head with a man she hardly knew. It was practical, it was necessary, and it was a complete scandal by most folks' standards. Her mother would have thrown a fit. Her father, though. Her father just might have understood. When they got back to the ranch, they spent the whole afternoon unloading supplies and figuring out which repairs needed to be done first. Caleb's experienced eyes saw things Eliza had either overlooked or just did not know how to fix. "That fence line is about to give way," he said, pointing out toward the eastern pasture. "The posts are rotted clear through. We will need to replace at least 20 of them." "I know," Eliza said. "I just never had the time or the materials. We have got both now. I will make a start on it tomorrow." They worked alongside each other all afternoon, with Caleb checking over the buildings and equipment while Eliza looked after the horses. She found herself watching him when she thought he was not looking. She noticed the efficient way he moved, the close attention he gave to every little detail, and the respect he showed for her father's hard work, even when pointing out its flaws. As the sun started to dip low, Eliza realized she had not had a bite to eat since breakfast. "I ought to make some dinner," she said. "Are you... you are welcome to join me, seeing as we are partners now." Caleb looked up from a gate hinge he was studying. "That would be much appreciated, ma'am, but I can surely cook for myself if you would prefer." "Do not be ridiculous. There is no sense in both of us cooking separate meals." She paused for a moment. "Although I should probably warn you, I am a better horse trainer than I am a cook." "I have been eating trail food for 12 years, Caleb said with a small grin. "I can guarantee your cooking is better than that." Dinner was a simple affair. Salt pork fried up with potatoes, a side of beans, and coffee strong enough to peel paint. They ate at the kitchen table, the very same one where her family had shared thousands of meals. Eliza tried her best not to think about how strange it felt to have someone new sitting there in her father's chair. "This is good," Caleb said, and he sounded like he truly meant it. "You are just being kind." "I am being honest. You ought to taste my cooking sometime. Then you would understand the difference." They settled into an easy talk about the plans for the next day, what needed to be done first, and how to split up the work to get the most done. It was all very professional and practical, which somehow made it easier than trying to talk about personal matters. After dinner, Caleb stood up and insisted on helping with the dishes, even though Eliza told him not to worry about it. "If we are partners, we share the work," he said. "All of it." "Even the woman's work?" Eliza asked, with a little challenge in her voice. "Especially that. I have been doing my own cooking and cleaning for more than 10 years. I do not see why it should all of a sudden become someone else's job just because there is a woman around." In that single moment, Eliza found herself liking him more than she had since he first showed up. As true darkness fell, Caleb gathered his bedroll from his horse and started toward the barn. "There are spare blankets in the house," Eliza called out after him, "if you need them." "I will be just fine. Sleep well, Miss Hartley." "Eliza," she said without even thinking about it, "if we are going to be partners, you should call me Eliza." He turned back, just a shadow against the last bit of daylight. "Then you had best call me Caleb. Partners do not need to stand on ceremony. Good night, Caleb." "Good night, Eliza." She watched him walk into the barn, then she went inside and bolted the door. That was a new habit she had picked up since yesterday's close call with the foreclosure. The house felt emptier than it usually did, but somehow it also felt more alive. For the first time in months, the air was filled with a sense of possibility instead of just plain dread. The next 3 days set a kind of rhythm that felt both strange and perfectly natural. They worked from sunup to sundown. Caleb took on the job of repairing the fences, while Eliza managed the horses and took care of the countless small tasks that keep a ranch going. They ate their meals together, talking over plans and problems, and slowly began to learn each other's ways of working and their personalities. Caleb, Eliza soon discovered, was methodical and patient. He was the sort of man who did a job right the first time, even if it took him a little longer. He did not talk much while he was working, but when he did say something, his words were thoughtful and helpful. He had a dry sense of humor. That would catch her by surprise sometimes, making little observations that made her laugh when she was least expecting to. For his part, Caleb seemed to appreciate that Eliza knew her own business and did not need somebody telling her what to do all the time. She caught him watching her one time as she worked with the horses. He had a look on his face that looked an awful lot like respect, right after she calmed down a jumpy mare with nothing more than a soft voice and a whole lot of patience. On the third day, they rode back into town to sign the partnership papers. Attorney Piton had everything ready to go. There were 2 copies of a detailed partnership agreement that spelled out every last detail of their arrangement. Eliza read through the whole thing twice, her heart thumping in her chest as the reality of it all started to sink in. This was it. This was the moment she officially stopped being the only owner of her father's ranch and became one half of something brand new. "Any questions before you sign?" Piton asked. Eliza looked over at Caleb. He met her gaze without wavering, his face perfectly calm. "No questions," she said. They both signed. Piton acted as the witness. The partnership was official. Walking out of that office felt like stepping into a whole new life. The same sun was shining down on the same dusty street, but everything had changed. "How are you feeling?" Caleb asked as they climbed back up on the wagon. "Terrified," Eliza admitted. "Relieved, hopeful, all of it at the same time." "That sounds about right," Caleb agreed. "I would be worried if you were not at least a little bit scared. It means you understand the weight of what we are taking on." As they drove out of town, Eliza saw Vernon Hastings standing outside the bank. He was watching them with a look on his face she could not quite figure out. She lifted her chin high and met his stare head on. He had tried to take everything from her. And now, she was driving away with a partner and a future. Let him chew on that for a while. Back at the ranch, they celebrated with a dinner that was a little bit better than usual. Eliza had splurged on a chicken in town, and she roasted it with some wild herbs she had picked from the hills. It almost felt like a party, though neither one of them said so out loud. After they ate, Caleb spread a rough drawing out on the table. "I have been thinking about that room addition," he said. "If we build it off the east side of the house, we can use the wall that is already there for support and tie it right into the existing roof line. It will not be anything fancy, but it will be solid and warm." Eliza looked over the drawing. "When would you start?" "Tomorrow, if the weather holds up. I can work on it in the evenings after I'm done with the fence repairs. That is a whole lot of work. Work is what I am here for." Over the next 2 weeks, the ranch began to change. The fence line got new posts that stood up straight and strong. The roof on the barn got patched. The well pump was fixed. And slowly, one board at a time, Caleb built himself a room onto the side of the house. Eliza helped out whenever she could, holding boards steady while he hammered, running to get tools, or mixing up mortar for the small stove he put in. She learned that he worked with the same quiet skill he brought to everything else, never rushing, but never wasting a single motion either. They fell into a daily routine that felt both close and carefully separate. Caleb was always up first in the morning. He would get the coffee started and see to his horse before Eliza even came downstairs. She would handle breakfast while he planned out the day's work. They would talk about what needed doing over coffee, then they would split up to handle their different jobs, meeting back up around noon for a quick meal. A quick dinner, and talked about what they had gotten done. The gossips in town slowly started to lose interest when nothing juicy ever really happened. A few folks even started to treat their partnership like it was the real deal. Ranchers would stop by to take a look at the horses. Merchants started dealing with Caleb like a legitimate business owner instead of just some stranger passing through. One afternoon in early November, a weathered old cattleman by the name of Jack Morrison rode up to look at the horses. He had known Eliza's father and had always been an honest man in his dealings. "Heard tell you took on a partner," Morrison said to Eliza. "Folks in town had some things to say about that." "I'm sure they did," Eliza said calmly. Morrison looked over at Caleb, who was busy strengthening a corral fence nearby. "Is that him?" "That is Caleb Mercer. Would you like to meet him?" "I already did, about 6 years ago. He was working a cattle drive that came through Colorado." A good man, from what I remember, an honest man to do business with. Morrison gave a nod of approval. You could have done a whole lot worse. That was the closest thing to a blessing that Eliza had gotten from anyone in town, and it meant more to her than she would have thought. As November wore on and the days got shorter, the ranch started to feel less like a heavy weight Eliza was trying to carry all by herself, and more like a real working operation. The pregnant mares were beginning to show now, their bellies getting round with the promise of new life. Caleb was nearly done with the addition to the room, and the two of them had found a way of working together that was based on respect for each other and a companionship that felt surprisingly easy. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the hills, Caleb said, "I need to head up to Colorado." Eliza's heart sank. "When?" "I've got to square things away with the cattle outfit before the real winter blows in. Need to make a call on the herd. And if we're fixing to start our own breeding program here, I'll have to bring back some bulls. How long are you planning to be gone? 3 weeks? Maybe a month? It all depends on the weather and how many head of cattle I decide to drive back. A whole month." The thought of running this ranch by herself again, even for a little while, filled Eliza with a feeling that was mighty close to panic. She had gotten used to having a hand, to being in a partnership. The notion of wrestling with it all alone again, even for a short spell, was surprisingly tough to swallow. "The mares," she said, "they're due to foal come December. If anything goes sideways, I'll be back long before then," Caleb promised her. "I'm thinking I'll head out in a couple of days and be home by the middle of December at the latest. That'll give us plenty of room before the foals arrive." "But what if you get held up? What if a blizzard hits, or—" "Eliza?" Caleb's voice was soft but solid. "I am not walking away from this partnership. I am going to handle some business we need to take care of so we can move forward. You ran this whole ranch by your lonesome for months before I ever showed up. You can surely handle a few weeks now. That was different. I didn't have a choice back then, and you do not have one now. This trip has to happen." He took a breath. "Unless you do not trust me to come on back." Eliza gave him a sharp look. "That is not it. I trust you. I just—" She wrestled with how to put the fear into words. "I am not used to leaning on someone, and now that I am, the thought of being alone again just feels harder than it did before." "That is what a partnership is," Caleb said softly. "It makes you stronger when you are together, but it also means you feel it more when you are apart. That does not mean we should not do it. It just means it is something that matters." He was right, and Eliza knew it deep down. She gave a slow, reluctant nod. "I am going to need you to take care of the fence work. While I am gone," Caleb went on, switching gears to practical things. "And there is a patch of roof on the barn that needs seeing to before the snow flies. I will leave you detailed notes about everything." "Detailed notes? You think I cannot remember what you tell me?" "I think you will have enough on your plate without trying to recall if I said the northwest or northeast corner needed bracing." They spent the next 2 days in a whirlwind of getting ready. Caleb put the finishing touches on the room addition. It was a simple space, but built solid, with a narrow bed, a small stove, a chair, and some pegs on the wall for his clothes. He moved his few belongings in, and all of a sudden the house felt different, more lived in, more like a home being shared instead of just a place being borrowed. He wrote out pages of directions for keeping the ranch up, got all the tools organized so everything was easy to lay a hand on, and had Eliza walk through some repairs she might have to deal with while he was away. She put up with all his fussing because she knew it was coming from a place of care, not because he thought she was incapable. The evening before he left, they shared a quiet supper. Eliza had cooked up a stew, thick with vegetables and meat, the kind of meal that sticks to your ribs and keeps a man going on a long ride. "I will send a message when I get to Colorado," Caleb said, "and another one before I start the ride back. If you need anything, if there is an emergency, you can send a wire to the cattle outfit. They will get word to me." "I will be just fine," Eliza said with more certainty in her voice than she felt in her heart. "I know you will, but it is all right to ask for help if you need it. That is what a partnership, which means you know you do not have to carry the whole load by yourself." After supper, Caleb walked out to check on his horse one last time. making sure the gelding was set for the long ride that lay ahead. Eliza stayed on the porch, a shawl pulled tight around her against the November cold, and she watched him move. He went about his work in the barn with the kind of comfort that said he already belonged there. Just 2 months back, he was a complete stranger. Now he was her partner, and she was putting her trust in him with half of everything she had. Even more than that, she was trusting him to ride back home. When he came back to the house, his saddlebags were packed and ready for the morning. Eliza was still standing on the porch. "You ought to get some rest," he told her. "I will be gone before the sun is up." "I just wanted to say," Eliza started, trying to find the right words, "thank you for all of it. For the debt, for this partnership, for building a room instead of just taking the barn, for treating this place like it means something." "It does mean something," Caleb said, plain and simple. "This ranch, our partnership, it is the bedrock of everything I have been working for. Of course it means something." Still, she said, "Thank you." He gave a nod and touched the brim of his hat in that way she had come to know was his way of saying goodbye. Then he headed for his new room. Eliza went inside to her own bed, but it took a long while for sleep to find her. She lay there awake, listening to the little noises of the house settling, the wind whistling through the eaves, and somewhere on the other side of her wall, the quiet sounds of another person in the house that had been only hers for so long. Tomorrow, Caleb would be gone, and she would be by herself again, running the ranch, waiting for him to return. And praying her faith in him was not a mistake. But for this one night, in this one moment, she was not alone. And that, she was starting to learn, made all the difference in the world. The sound of hoofbeats growing fainter in the dark before dawn was the most lonesome sound Eliza had ever heard. She stood there on the porch, her coffee cup going cold in her hands, and she watched until the very dust Caleb's horse kicked up had drifted back to the ground. Then she was on her own with 3 weeks of hard work, 2 mares heavy with foal, and a creeping suspicion that maybe she had trusted a man too soon, believed a stranger too easily. He had promised a partnership, but he might just ride off into Colorado and never look back. She pushed the thought away. Caleb had put his name on legal papers. He had built a whole room onto her house. He had put his own money down right alongside hers. A man did not do all that if he was planning to just disappear. Even so, the ranch felt bigger and quieter than it had before he ever showed up, like his being there had taken up more space than she ever knew. Eliza buried herself in the work. The fence line Caleb had begun needed to be finished. The barn roof he had pointed out needed patching before the winter storms rolled in. The horses needed their daily care, and the pregnant mares needed extra looking after as they got bigger and more uncomfortable with each passing day. There was firewood that needed splitting, water that needed hauling, and 1,000 little fixes that had been put off for want of time and energy she did not have. By the time that first day alone was over, Eliza's hands were covered in blisters and her back was one big ache. She made a simple supper of beans and cornbread, and she ate it standing by the stove because the thought of sitting at that empty table was just too much to bear. She fell into bed so worn out that she did not even have the strength left to worry. The second day brought a sharp wind down from the north, the kind that carried the promise of snow even though skies stayed stubbornly blue. Eliza was up on the barn roof with a hammer and nails clutched in her half-frozen fingers, trying her best to remember everything Caleb had shown her about laying the shingles just right. She was about halfway done when one of the pregnant mares started acting up, showing clear signs of distress. Eliza scrambled down that ladder so fast she almost took a tumble, her heart hammering in her chest. The mare, a bay named Sage, was pawing at the dirt, walking in tight circles, her sides dark with sweat, even in the cold air. "Easy, girl," Eliza whispered, walking toward her slow and steady. "Easy now." But Sage's eyes were rolling back to white, and her breath was coming in ragged, harsh gasps. This was not right. The foal was not due for another 6 weeks at least. If she was going into labor this early, Eliza knew a good bit about horse births, but not everything. Her father had always handled the real tough deliveries with Eliza there to help. She had seen trouble before, knew the warning signs, but she had never had to handle a premature birth all by herself. She got Sage into a clean stall, laid down thick with fresh straw, and checked her over carefully. The mare's water had not broken yet, but you could see the contractions, her whole body tightening up with each one. Too early. This was all happening way too early. "Come on, Sage," Eliza whispered, running a hand down the mare's sweat-drenched neck. "Just hold on, you just hold on now." For 3 solid hours, Eliza stayed right there with that horse, watching every contraction, every change in her breathing, ready to step in if the birth really started. She said every prayer she knew, and even made up a few new ones on the spot. Then, like a miracle, the contractions started to spread out, getting weaker instead of stronger. Breathing got easier. The trouble, whatever had brought it on, was passing. By the time Eliza finally stumbled back into the house, it was way past midnight. She fell onto her bed, still in her dusty work clothes, too bone-tired to care about being proper or comfortable. The next morning, Sage seemed to be doing better, though Eliza kept a close eye on her all day long. There were no more contractions, no more signs of trouble. Whatever had happened, the mare had pulled through it, but the whole scare had shaken Eliza to her core. What if the contractions had kept going? What if the foal had come early and needed special care she could not give? What if it had been a breech birth, or there was bleeding, or any of the dozen other things that could go wrong in a heartbeat? She would have been out there all alone, making life or death calls with nobody to turn to, no second pair of hands to help out. That night she sat at her kitchen table with Caleb's detailed notes spread out before her, and for the first time since he had ridden away, she let herself cry. It was not really from sadness, but from the crushing weight of all the responsibility, the deep-down exhaustion of doing it all on her own, and the fear of failing when failure could mean losing an animal, or worse. She cried for her father, who had always made this work look so simple, for her mother, who had never once complained about the loneliness and the hardship, and for herself, just trying to be strong enough to carry on a legacy that felt way too heavy for one person's shoulders. The tears did not fix a single thing, but they did help. She washed her face, made herself some coffee, and got right back to work. A week after Caleb had left, a telegram showed up from Colorado. The rider from town brought it out himself, clearly itching for some town gossip, but he left disappointed when Eliza just read. He took it without a word and rode off. The message was short: arrived safe, herd healthy, weather good. Will write. C.M. Eliza read it over 3 times. She was relieved to know he had made it all the way to Colorado, but frustrated by how little those few words told her. Will write. But when? And with what news? The letter he promised showed up 5 days later. It was longer than the telegram, but still short and to the point, just like Caleb. He had found the herd, and it was in good shape. He was in talks with the outfit's foreman about which cows to sell and which ones to drive back. The weather had gotten cold, but the skies were still clear. He figured he would start the journey home within a week. How are the mares? He had written at the bottom. Any signs they might foal early? Make sure Sage stays calm and keeps eating well. Keep an eye out for any swelling in her legs. That can be a sign of trouble. And do not you try to finish that barn roof by yourself if the weather turns bad. It can wait until I get back. You are worth more than a few shingles. That last sentence brought a lump to Eliza's throat. She carefully folded the letter and put it away in her father's desk. Then she went outside to check on Sage, who, sure enough, had some swelling in her back legs. Eliza spent the rest of the day digging through her father's old veterinary books for a cure, mixing up a poultice, and wrapping the mare's legs in clean bandages. By the next morning, the swelling had gone down. The days started to run into each other. Just work and worry, and small wins followed by small problems. The air got colder. The first snows came, just light dustings that were gone by afternoon, but they were a warning of the bigger storms on the way. Eliza finished mending the fence line, patched up the barn roof as best she could, and got the ranch as ready as she could for the coming winter. She also started to realize just how much work Caleb had been doing that she had never really noticed. The firewood did not chop itself. The water did not just appear from the well. The tools did not get cleaned and put away on their own. All the little upkeep jobs that somehow got finished when two people shared the load were now piling up, needing time and attention she just did not have. By the third week, Eliza was running on pure grit and black coffee. She had lost weight she could not spare, and the dark circles under her eyes had settled in for good. But the ranch was still running. The horses were all healthy, and she had proven to herself that she could, in fact, handle it all alone if she had to. She just really, really hoped she would not have to. On the 22nd day since Caleb had left, Eliza was in the barn, doctoring a small cut on one of the geldings when she heard the sound of hoofbeats and the lowing of cattle that you just cannot mistake. Her heart just about jumped out of her chest. She dropped the tin of medicine and ran outside. 3 riders were coming up the road, pushing a small herd of about 30 cattle ahead of them, moving at that slow, tired pace of animals that have traveled a long way. And at the head of it all, sitting straight in his saddle, even though he looked dead tired, was Caleb Mercer. The relief that washed over Eliza was so strong it made her head swim. She had to grab the barn door frame to keep herself steady, watching as the riders skillfully moved the cattle into the west pasture. Caleb swung down from his horse, said a few words to the other 2 men, and then turned toward the house. His eyes found her right away, and even from that distance, she saw his look change from weary to worried. He crossed the ground between them with long strides. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "No, I am fine. I just—" Eliza realized she was trembling. "I am fine. You are back. 3 days early. We made better time than I figured on." Caleb's eyes were searching her face, taking in the lost weight, the exhaustion, the clear signs of someone who had been pushing way too hard for way too long. "Have you been eating?" "Yes, most of the time when I think of it." "Eliza, the mares are fine," she said in a rush, because she knew that would be his next question. "Sage had some early contractions about 2 weeks ago, but they passed. I have been watching her like a hawk. She had some swelling in her legs, but I doctored it, and it is mostly gone now. Everything is fine." Caleb looked like he wanted to argue that point, but one of the other riders called out to him. "Mercer, we got the cattle settled. You need us to stick around and help with anything else?" "No, Tom, you and Davis go on into town. Get yourselves some hot grub and a warm bed. I will settle up with you in the morning." The 2 riders touched the brims of their hats and rode off, looking too tired to think about much besides sleep. Caleb turned back to Eliza. "Come on, you need to sit down before you fall down." "I'm not going to fall down. Just humor me." He put a hand on her elbow and steered her toward the house, and Eliza was too bone-weary to put up a fight. Inside, he sat her down at the kitchen table and went straight to building up the fire in the stove. "When was the last time you ate a real meal?" he asked. "I eat real meals." "That is not an answer." Eliza tried to think back. "I believe I had eggs yesterday morning." Caleb muttered something under pay. He let out a breath that didn't sound too pleased. He rooted around in the pantry, pulled out what he needed, and in just a few minutes, he had bacon singing in the skillet. The smell made Eliza's stomach rumble so loud that Caleb shot her a look that plainly said, "See, I knew it." While that was cooking, he poured her a cup of real coffee, the strong, hot kind, and just stood there watching her with his arms folded across his chest. You'd think he was worried she might just vanish if he blinked. "I told you to look after yourself," he said. "I did look after myself," she shot back. "I just had to look after everything else, too." "You look like you haven't had a good night's sleep in a week." "I sleep," Eliza insisted. "Just not all at once." Caleb just shook his head and went back to the stove. He loaded up a plate with a mountain of bacon, eggs, and fried potatoes, then set it right in front of her and said, "Eat." Eliza felt like arguing just for the sake of it, but the food smelled way too good and her stomach was empty. She ate, and Caleb cooked up another batch for himself. For a good while, the only sounds in the kitchen were forks on plates and the friendly crackle from the fireplace. At last, Caleb said, "Tell me what went on with Sage." Eliza told him the whole story of the scare with the early contractions. All those hours they watched her, and the swelling that popped up and had to be treated. Caleb listened quiet-like, not saying a word, his face getting more worried with every detail she shared. "You should have sent a wire," he said when she was done. "And say what? Come on back because I got spooked? You were doing important business. I handled it." "Being partners means we handle things together, Eliza. The scary stuff, too. You weren't here, so I handled it by myself. That is what folks do." Caleb stayed silent for a long spell. "I never should have left you on your own for 3 weeks. That was just poor thinking on my part. You had to go. We both knew it. I should have set things up better, hired on some help for you while I was gone. We can't afford to hire help just yet. We can afford that a whole lot better than we can afford you working yourself into an early grave trying to do it all." He shoved his clean plate away from him. "From here on out, if I have to be gone for more than a couple of days, we're making sure you have some help. And that's not up for debate." Eliza wanted to fight him on it, but the tiredness was catching up to her now that the rush of him being back was wearing off. "Fine. Did you bring the bulls back?" "3 of them, young with good bloodlines. Their genetics are different enough so we can build up a healthy breeding program. They are out with the herd in the Oyo pasture." He took a breath. I also brought back some of my own personal stock. I had to sell off the rest to the outfit, but I held on to my best breeding cows. I figure we can build up from there." "How many head all told?" 32 cattle and 3 bulls. It is not a huge operation, but it is a start." Eliza did some quick figuring in her head. If they managed things right, they could double that herd in 2 years. In 5 years, they could have a real-deal profitable cattle operation. With that and the horse breeding, the ranch could finally do more than just get by. It could actually prosper. "That is good," she said. "That is really good." Caleb was looking at her again with that worried set to his face. "When was the last time you slept through the whole night?" "What do you call a whole night?" "More than 4 hours." Eliza thought about telling a fib, but what was the use? "I do not remember." "Right. You are going to bed now. It is not even dark yet. And you are dead on your feet. Go on and sleep. I will take care of the evening chores. You just drove cattle all the way from Colorado. And you have been running this whole ranch by yourself for 3 weeks. I am tired. You are exhausted. There is a big difference." When Eliza still did not budge, he said a little softer, "Please, just let me handle things for 1 night. You have more than earned it." The kindness in his voice was what finally broke her. Eliza nodded, too worn out to argue anymore, and walked upstairs. She planned to change into her nightgown, to wash her face, to do all the things a person does before bed. Instead, she sat on the side of her bed to pull off her boots, and woke up 10 hours later still in her day clothes with a blanket over her that she knew was not there before. Morning sunlight was pouring in the window. Eliza sat up, feeling all turned around, and it hit her that Caleb must have come in sometime in the night to cover her up. The idea should have felt like an intrusion, but it just felt like he was taking care of her. She got changed for real this time, washed up, and went downstairs to find breakfast was already on the stove. Caleb was gone, likely out tending to the stock. There on the table was a note written in his blocky hand. "Stay inside, rest. We will handle all chores today. This is not a request." Eliza could not help but smile. She ignored the note naturally, and headed out to help with the work, but she moved at a slower, more deliberate pace than she had in weeks. And when Caleb gave her a frustrated look from across the barn, she just gave a little shrug. "Partners share the work, remember? You said it yourself." "I meant when you are not half dead from being worn out." "I am not half dead. I am just a quarter dead, totally different." "You are impossible." "Well, you are the one who decided to be partners with me." Something in Caleb's face softened right then. "Yeah, I did." They worked on through the morning, falling right back into the easy rhythm they'd had before he left. It was amazing how fast it all felt normal again. The way they knew what the other was doing without a word, the natural way the tasks got divided, the simple comfort of working side by side. By afternoon, Eliza was starting to feel more like her old self. They walked out to the oil pasture to look over the new cattle, and Eliza had to give it to him. Caleb had picked well. The animals were healthy and solid, with the sturdy frame you need for this tough country. "They will do," she said, which was high praise coming from her, and both of them knew it. "The bulls ought to service the mares just as well as the cows if we need 'em to," Caleb said, "though I reckon you will want Ranger handling most of that business." "Definitely. But it is good to have options." They stood there for a bit, watching the cattle graze. The winter sun was low and weak, but it was there, and the wind was cold but not biting. It was one of those perfect, quiet moments on the ranch. Everything felt peaceful, like it was right where it belonged. Then Caleb said, "I need to tell you something." Eliza's stomach did a little flip. Here it was, whatever bad news he had been holding back. "What is it?" "While I was up in Colorado, I had a lot of time to think about this partnership, about our deal, about how things have been going." He paused for a second, like he was picking his words with care. "This is working, Eliza. Honestly, it is better than I ever figured. You are a good partner, fair, capable, and you pull your own weight and then some. Maybe a little too much, judging by the last 3 weeks. Is there a but coming? No. No but. I am just saying that I am in this for the long haul. No matter what happens, no matter how hard it gets, I am committed to making this partnership work. I just wanted you to know that." The wave of relief that washed over Eliza was stronger than she would have guessed. She had been steeling herself for him to say he was having second thoughts, that 3 weeks away had made him rethink everything, that this had all been a big mistake. Instead, he was digging in deeper. "I am committed too," she said. "Even when you drive me crazy, insisting on doing everything by the book instead of just getting it done. And even when you work yourself into the ground, trying to prove you do not need any help. Even then." They started walking back to the house, side by side, through grass that was already turning brown for the winter. Eliza found herself thinking how much her life had changed in just 3 months. The foreclosure notice, the debt, the crushing feeling of trying to save her father's ranch all by herself. It all felt like it happened to someone else a lifetime ago. That evening, they ate a real dinner together at the kitchen table. Caleb must have really missed a decent meal on his trip because he had put in some actual effort. He had cooked a steak from the new cattle, roasted some potatoes with wild onions, and even baked a pie from dried apples. It almost felt like a celebration. "This is mighty fancy," Eliza pointed out. 3 weeks of trail grub makes a man appreciate a real kitchen. "I thought you said my cooking was good." "It is, but you do not make pie." "Fair point." After they ate, they sat out on the porch, even with the chill in the air, bundled up in their coats, watching the stars pop out in the darkening sky. Caleb had brought out more coffee, and the warmth of the mug felt good in Eliza's hands. "The mares," Caleb said. "How close do you figure they are? Sage could go any day now. She has dropped. You can see the change in her belly's shape. The other one, Willow, probably has another week or 2. We should set up a watch schedule. Make sure somebody is checking on them every few hours through the night. I was already planning on sleeping out in the barn once Sage gets real close." "We both will then. We can take shifts. That way we both get some rest. But the horses are never left alone." The easy way he said "we" still sent a little jolt through Eliza. She had been on her own for so long that having someone else just naturally include himself in her plans felt like a gift she never knew she was missing. "Caleb," she said without even thinking, "thank you. For coming back, for bringing the cattle, for—" She waved her hand, not quite able to put words to all of it. "For everything." He looked over at her, his eyes looking serious in the starlight. "You do not have to thank me for keeping my word, Eliza. That is just being a decent human being. Still, a lot of men would not have. Then you have known the wrong kind of men. Maybe she had, or maybe she just never had the chance to know a man like Caleb Mercer. Someone who said what he meant and then did what he said. Who saw a partnership as something sacred, not just something convenient. Who looked at her like an equal, not some woman who needed to be managed. That night, Eliza slept like a rock in her own bed, a deep and dreamless sleep, knowing that downstairs in his room, Caleb was doing the same. The house felt whole in a way it had not since her parents passed. Not because there was a man in it, but because it was not a place built for loneliness anymore. The next morning came, and with it the first real snow of the season. Big, fat flakes fell thick and fast, blanketing the whole ranch in a quiet layer of white. Caleb and Eliza worked side by side to make sure all the animals were sheltered with extra feed, that the water troughs would not turn to solid ice, and that the firewood was stacked up close to the house. By the middle of the morning, the snow was coming down so thick they could hardly make out the barn from the kitchen window. "This is going to be a bad one," Caleb said, looking out. "Good thing you made it back when you did. Another day and you would have been caught right in the middle of it. Another day, and I would have been worried sick about you being caught in it all by yourself." They passed the day inside, taking care of indoor chores, mending tack, sorting supplies, and going through the account books together. Caleb laid out the records from the cattle sale for Eliza, showing her how he had worked the prices, what he had spent on supplies for the trip back. "You are better with figures than I would have guessed," Eliza said. "A trail boss has to be," he replied. "You are handling payroll, supply costs, road fees, and sale prices at the end of the line. You get good with arithmetic, or you go broke." Eliza showed him her breeding logs, the detailed records her father had started, and that she had kept up. Caleb asked smart questions about bloodlines and how traits were passed down, showing he knew a lot more about raising quality horses than he had first let on. They fit together well when they worked, Eliza thought. They had different skills and different knowledge, but they shared the same good sense and the same drive to work hard. It was a solid footing for a partnership. That night, the storm was still howling outside. They ate their dinner by the light of a lamp, as snow drifted up against the windows, and the wind moaned around the corners of the house. After they cleaned up, they sat together by the fire. Caleb was in the old, worn armchair that used to be her father's. Eliza sat on the sofa with a blanket over her lap. "Tell me some more about your kin," Eliza said. "You brought up your mother's farm. What all happened with it?" Caleb stayed quiet for so long she figured he was not going to answer. Finally, he spoke. "My daddy died when I was 16. A horse kicked him square in the head. Just a pure freak accident. My mama, she tried to keep that farm running, but she didn't know a thing about the money side of it. My daddy had always taken care of all that. Before a year was out, she was behind on debts she never even knew they had. The bank came and took it. We lost every last thing. I am sorry. She passed on 2 years later. I reckon she just plain gave up. She could not stand living in town after losing the land. I was 18 years old, out on my own with nothing but what I could carry and a fire in my belly to never be that helpless again. So you started putting back every dollar for 12 years. I figured if I ever got another shot at owning land, I'd make damn sure nobody could ever take it from me." He looked straight at her. "That is why I could not just sit and watch it happen to you. I could not stand by and let that bank take it all when I had the money to stop them." Eliza understood him a whole lot better now. The careful saving, the dedication to their partnership, the fierce way he protected what they were building. He was not just putting his money into the land. He was trying to give his mother's story a different, better ending. "We are not going to lose this ranch," she said with a firm voice. "Not either one of us. We are going to build it into something that will last." "I believe you," Caleb said. "I surely do." The fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, the storm was howling. But inside, right then, everything felt safe and sound. 3 days later, the storm finally wore itself out, leaving the ranch buried under 2 feet of snow. They dug their way out, went to check on all the animals, and were relieved to find that everything had made it through. The pregnant mares were a bit antsy, but they were healthy. Caleb set up that watch schedule he had talked about. They took turns checking on Sage every 3 hours, day and night, looking for any sign that her time was coming. Eliza showed him what to look for: the nervous pacing, the pawing at the ground, the way a mare's belly would draw up tight with a contraction. On the 5th night after he got back, Sage went into labor. Eliza was on watch making her midnight rounds when she found the mare in real trouble. She ran to wake up Caleb, and the two of them stayed with the horse through the birth. It was a hard one. The foal was turned all wrong. One leg was folded back instead of both of them stretching forward. In that position, it could not be born without hurting them both. "I have to reach in there and get it turned around," Eliza said, her voice strained with fear. "If I cannot do it, we are going to lose them both." "Just tell me what to do," Caleb said, his voice as calm as a summer morning. "How can I help you?" His steadiness was what she needed to focus. Together, they went to work. Eliza reached carefully into the birth canal to guide the foal's leg forward. All the while, Caleb held Sage's head, talking soft and low, keeping the mare from getting spooked. It took 20 long, hard minutes. Eliza's arm was deep inside the laboring horse, her fingers feeling around for that tiny hoof that needed to be moved. At long last, she felt it slide into the right place. "Got it," she gasped out. "Both legs are forward now. She ought to be able to push." And Sage surely did, with a mighty effort, until a wet, long-legged foal slid out onto the straw. A filly, perfect and whole, already trying to lift up her head. Eliza sat back on her heels, shaking all over with relief, and being plain worn out. Caleb was grinning like a fool, still kneeling there by Sage's head. "We did it," he said. "Yes, we did," Eliza had to agree. They stayed out in the barn until the little foal was up on her feet and nursing, looking healthy as could be after such a rough start. Sage licked her new baby clean with a look of pure pride, already a protective mama. Walking back to the house in the cold air just before dawn, Eliza noticed her hands were still trembling. Caleb saw it too and put his arm around her shoulders. It was just for a second, a small comfort between partners who had just been through something mighty and tense. "You were just amazing back there," he said. "I was scared to death." "Well, being scared and doing it anyway, that is what amazing looks like." Inside, Caleb put on a pot of coffee while Eliza washed up. They sat there at the kitchen table, too keyed up to even think about sleeping, no matter the hour. "I could not have done that by myself," Eliza admitted. "If you had not been here, if you were still off in Colorado, I do not know if I could have stayed calm enough to turn that foal." "But I was here," Caleb said simply. "That is what a partnership is all about. When things get hard, when they get scary, you are not in it alone." "I spent so many years thinking I had to do everything on my own," Eliza said softly. "That asking for help was a weakness, that leaning on somebody else was dangerous. And now I am starting to see the difference between leaning on someone and having a partner, between being weak and being wise." She looked him in the eye. "You have taught me that, whether you meant to or not." Something changed in Caleb's face. A warmth, maybe, or just him seeing the trust she was putting in him. "You have taught me a few things, too, about holding on to a dream, about not giving up when the work gets tough, about what it means to love something so much you would break your own heart trying to save it." They sat together in the quiet kitchen as the sun started to peek over the horizon. Just two folks who had been strangers 4 months ago, now tied together by contracts and cattle, and a perfect little filly sleeping out in the barn. Eliza knew, with a sudden clearness, that this partnership was the best choice she had ever made, not just for the ranch, but for her own self. Whatever was coming next, and she had a feeling plenty was coming, both good and bad. They were going to face it side by side. And that right there made all the difference in the world. They named the filly Starlight on account of the white blaze that ran down her face like a streak of moonlight. She did real well in those first weeks, getting stronger every day, and Eliza would spend hours just watching her discover the world on those impossibly long legs. But that joy of new life had a shadow cast over it by their worry for Willow, the second pregnant mare. She was getting bigger, but she was not showing any of the usual signs that labor was getting close. "She should have dropped her belly by now," Eliza said one morning in the middle of December, running a hand along Willow's swollen middle. The mare was not comfortable, shifting her weight from one foot to the other all the time, but nothing was moving along like it should. Caleb frowned, watching the horse with a careful eye. "How far overdue do you reckon she is?" "Nearly 2 weeks, maybe even more." The breeding dates were not exact. Eliza's voice was tight with worry. "I have never had a mare go this long. Something is not right." They started watching her even closer, checking on Willow every 2 hours all day and all night. Caleb took the night shifts without a single complaint, knowing that Eliza was already worn thin with worry. The winter had come in hard, bringing storms that dropped snow faster than they could shovel it, and the daily work of keeping the ranch going in that bitter cold left both of them bone-tired. 3 days before Christmas, Caleb came back to the house just as the sun was coming up, his face all tight and worried. "She is down," he said, "and she cannot get back up." Eliza's heart just about stopped. She grabbed her coat and ran for the barn with Caleb right on her heels. Willow was lying in her stall, her sides heaving up and down, her eyes rolling with distress. When Eliza tried to coax her to stand, the mare hardly moved. "How long has she been down like this?" Eliza asked, already checking the horse over. "I found her this way about 20 minutes ago. She was on her feet at the midnight check." Eliza's hands moved over Willow's belly, feeling for the foal's position, checking for any sign that labor was starting. What she felt turned her blood to ice. "The foal is positioned all wrong. It is not just a leg out of place. It is completely sideways. There is no way it can be born like this." "We need a veterinarian," she said, fighting to keep her voice from shaking. "Right now. The closest vet is clear over in Socorro. That is a 3-hour ride in good weather, and we have got 2 feet of fresh snow on the ground." "Then go, and ride hard. I will stay here with her." Caleb did not waste a second arguing. He saddled his horse and vanished into the dark of the early morning, while Eliza stayed with Willow, trying everything she knew to make the mare more comfortable, just trying to buy some time until help could get there. But time was the one thing they did not have. 2 hours crawled by. Willow started getting worse and fast. Her breathing got real shallow. Her body temperature began to drop. And no matter what Eliza tried, the mare was slipping away. Eliza had delivered foals in trouble before. She had helped her daddy with all sorts of emergencies. But this was more than she could handle. The foal was too big, turned too badly, and Willow was just too weak to make it through the kind of serious procedure that might save the baby. Eliza sat in the straw next to the dying mare, with tears pouring down her face, and made the hardest choice of her entire life. She could not save them both. The foal was likely already gone, trapped in a way that had probably cut off its air hours ago. But Willow, if Eliza acted right now, if she stopped trying to save the foal and just focused on keeping the mare alive, there was still a chance. With hands that would not stop shaking, she did what had to be done. The whole thing was awful and heartbreaking, and by the time it was over, Eliza was covered in blood and sobbing. But Willow was breathing easier, that impossible weight finally gone from inside her. The foal, a colt that was perfectly formed, had been gone for hours. Caleb got back with the veterinarian to find Eliza sitting against the stall wall. The dead foal was wrapped in a canvas beside her, and Willow was standing on wobbly legs, but she was alive. Dr. Harrison took one look at everything and knew right away what had happened. He checked Willow from top to bottom, gave her some medicine to keep an infection from setting in, and then he turned to Eliza. "You did the right thing," he said in a quiet voice. "The foal was already lost. You saved the mare's life." "I know," Eliza whispered, "but that does not make it any easier." After the vet left, Caleb buried the little colt in the frozen ground while Eliza stayed with Willow. It took him 3 hours of backbreaking work, with the ground fighting the shovel every inch of the way. But he did it because it had to be done, and because he knew Eliza needed to know the foal had been laid to rest proper. When he came back into the barn, Eliza was still right there, just sitting in the of straw, just staring off at nothing. "Come on inside," Caleb said softly. "You are frozen solid. I should have seen it sooner. I should have called the vet days ago. You did everything you possibly could. Sometimes everything you can do just is not enough. My father never lost a single foal, not in 30 years of breeding them. Your father had 30 years of practice. You have had 3. And you made a decision that saved Willow's life. That is what matters." Eliza let him help her get to her feet, let him lead her back into the house. She felt numb, just going through the motions of washing up and putting on clean clothes without really thinking about what she was doing. When she came back downstairs, Caleb had soup warming on the stove and had brewed a strong pot of coffee. "Eat," he said, and the way he said it left no room for argument. She ate because he told her to, not tasting a single bite. Her mind kept replaying every second of the last week, trying to figure out what she had missed, what she could have done differently. "Stop," Caleb said, watching her. "Stop what?" "Blaming yourself. I can see it happening. You are going back over every single decision, every choice, looking for where you messed up. Do not do that." "How can I not?" That foal died because sometimes things just go wrong. Because nature is not always gentle or fair. Because even when you do everything just right, you can still lose." He leaned in closer, his eyes serious. "You want to know what I see? I see someone who fought for 3 hours in a freezing barn to save what she could save. Someone who had to make an impossible choice and had the strength to see it through. That is not failure, Eliza. That right there is courage." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to accept that she had done the best she could in a situation where there were no good answers. But all she could see was that perfect little colt, gone before he ever took his first breath. That night she cried herself to sleep as the winter wind howled around the little ranch house. In the darkest part of the night, she woke up and found Caleb sitting in a chair right beside her bed. He was just keeping watch, the same way he did the night Sage had such a hard time giving birth. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Just making sure you're all right." "I am fine." "No, you're not," he said gently. "But you will be." He took a breath. "My first time on a cattle drive, we lost 100 head trying to cross a river. They stampeded in the water and animals were drowning. There was not a single thing we could do. I felt like I had failed, like I was to blame for every one of them. The trail boss, he told me something I never forgot. He said you can do everything right and still lose. That does not mean you failed. It just means you are working with living things in a world you cannot predict." Did that help you, him saying that? Not at first, he admitted, but it did later on. Caleb got up. "Get some rest. Tomorrow is another day, and there is work to be done." She finally did sleep, and when she woke up the next morning, the sadness was still there, but it was not so heavy anymore. She could breathe again. Christmas came and went without much fuss. They worked all day, same as usual. But Caleb surprised her with a small gift. It was a leather journal for her to keep breeding records in, much finer than anything she had been using. "For keeping track of everything," he said. "The successes and the failures, so you can learn from it all." "I did not get you anything," Eliza said, feeling her face get warm. "You gave me a partnership and a place worth building on. That is more than enough of a gift." They had a special dinner, better than usual. Caleb roasted a chicken, and Eliza made biscuits that, for once, turned out just right. It was simple, but it felt important. It was their first holiday together. It marked just how far they had come since that awful day in October when the bank was ready to take it all away. As winter got deeper, they found their new rhythm. Taking care of the cattle took up all their time. They were breaking ice on water troughs, hauling feed through deep snow, and checking on the animals in the brutal cold. The horses needed care every day, and Starlight needed special attention as she grew bigger. Between the two of them, Caleb and Eliza got it all done. But some days the work felt like it would never end, and the cold felt like it was trying to break them both. One terrible morning in January, it was so cold that water froze solid just minutes after you poured it. Caleb came inside from his chores with his face pale from the cold. His hands were shaking so bad he could not even hold his coffee cup. "That is it," Eliza said with a firm voice. "We are hiring some help. At least one ranch hand to get us through the rest of this winter. We can manage. We can barely manage, and it is killing us both. We need help, Caleb. That is not a sign of weakness. That is just being smart." He looked at her for a long, quiet moment, and then he nodded. "You're right. I will go ask around in town, see if anybody is looking for winter work." 2 days later, a young man named Jesse Colton rode up to the ranch. He was 19 years old, thin as a rail, with eager eyes and calloused hands that showed he was no stranger to hard work. "I heard y'all might need a hand," he said, standing in the yard and holding his hat. "I am good with both cattle and horses. The cold weather does not bother me. I work hard, I do not complain, and I am honest." Eliza looked over at Caleb, who was sizing up the young man with the sharp eye of someone who had hired his share of trail hands over the years. "You got any references?" Caleb asked. "I worked over at the Morrison Ranch last summer. Jack Morrison will speak for me." That was all Caleb needed to hear. Morrison was known for running his place well and not putting up with any foolishness. $1 a day plus your board," Caleb said. "You will sleep in the barn and eat your meals with us at the house. We expect you to work whatever hours we need, and in the winter, that is most of them." "Yes, sir. And you take your orders from either one of us. This is a partnership. What Miss Hartley says carries the same weight as what I say." Jesse looked at Eliza with a new kind of respect. "Yes, sir." "Yes, ma'am." Having Jesse around changed everything. The daily chores started to feel possible again. The three of them could take turns with the duties, making sure nothing got missed, and that nobody worked themselves into the ground. Jesse turned out to be just what he said he was. He was hard-working, dependable, and he knew his way around livestock. On top of that, his being there changed things between Eliza and Caleb in a way neither of them had seen coming. With a third person around, even just during the workday, they started to notice how close they had become. They noticed how they had started finishing each other's sentences, and the easy way they would touch. Caleb would put his hand on her shoulder when he walked behind her chair. Eliza would fix his scarf before he headed out into the cold. One evening in late January, after Jesse had gone to the barn for the night, Eliza and Caleb were sitting by the fire just like they usually did. The silence between them was comfortable, but it was filled with something that neither of them had dared to name. "Can I ask you something?" Eliza finally said. "Always. Do you ever think about the future? I do not just mean the ranch, but everything else." Caleb put down the piece of harness he was fixing. "I think about it all the time. And what do you see?" He was quiet for a long while. "Honestly," he said, "I see this partnership turning into something more. I see us building more than just a successful ranch. I see us building a life together. I see." He paused like he was thinking over his words. "What?" Eliza urged him, her heart starting to beat faster. "I see myself asking you to marry me," Caleb said quietly. "Not because it is the practical thing to do, or because it is what people expect. It is because somewhere between last October and right now, I fell in love with you." Those words just hung there in the air between them. They were brave and honest and completely took her by surprise. Eliza felt like she could not breathe. "Caleb, you do not have to answer me now. You do not have to answer at all if that is not what you want. I am not trying to change our partnership or make things messy. I just had to let you know. I am not very good at hiding how I feel, and I do not want to spend the rest of this winter pretending I do not love you because I do." Eliza just stared at him, her thoughts all jumbled up. She should have seen this coming. She should have known what was growing between them. But she had been so focused on the ranch, on just surviving, on proving she could handle this partnership, that she had missed the most important thing of all. She was in love with him, too. The feeling hit her like a physical blow. Somewhere between him paying off her debt and building a new room on her house and staying up all night with a horse in labor and making sure she ate when she forgot. Somewhere in all of that, she had fallen completely and totally in love with Caleb Mercer. I need some time, she heard herself say, to think about this, about what it would all mean. You take all the time you need, Caleb said. But she could see the disappointment in his eyes. Nothing has to change. We are partners first, always. But everything had already changed. The words were out there now, and Eliza could not take them back. She could not go back to just seeing Caleb as her business partner when her heart pounded every single time he looked her way. She went to bed that night with her mind in a storm, spinning with all the possibilities and all her fears. Getting married meant tying herself to someone for good. It meant trusting another person with not just her ranch, but her entire life. It meant letting herself be vulnerable in ways a partnership did not ask for. It meant admitting she needed someone, not just for practical things, but for matters of the heart. The thought scared her half to death. But it also filled her with a kind of hope she had not felt since before her parents passed away. It was the hope of building something that would last, of not having to face the future all alone, of loving someone and being loved right back. 3 days later, disaster struck in a way none of them could have ever imagined. Caleb was out working in the arroyo pasture, checking on the cattle when his horse got spooked by something. Maybe it was a snake or maybe just a shadow. The horse reared up and Caleb, caught by surprise, was thrown hard. He landed all wrong. His leg twisted underneath him and the awful sound of a bone breaking echoed across the empty field. Jesse found him 20 minutes later. He was barely conscious and pale with pain, his leg bent at an angle that made the young man's stomach churn. "Get Eliza," Caleb managed to say through clenched teeth. "Do not move me. Just get her." Jesse took off for the house, and Eliza came at a dead run with her medical kit in her hand. One look at Caleb's leg told her everything. The break was bad. It was a compound fracture with the bone sticking right out through the skin. It was the kind of injury that could leave a man crippled for good if it was not treated right. "We need the doctor," she said, forcing her voice to stay calm. "Jesse, you ride for Socorro as fast as you can. You tell Dr. Harrison that this is urgent. That will take hours," Jesse argued. "In this cold with an injury like that. We do not have time to argue. Just go." Jesse left, and Eliza was all alone with Caleb, who was drifting in and out of consciousness from the shock and the pain. "Don't you dare die on me," she told him fiercely, as she worked to brace his leg with makeshift splints. "You hear me, Caleb Mercer? You do not get to tell me you love me and then die 3 days later. That is not how this is going to work." Through the fog of pain, Caleb managed what might have been a small smile. "I was not planning on dying." "Good, because I have some things to say to you, and you are going to be awake and clear-headed when I say them." With Jesse's help when he returned, she managed the terrible journey of getting him back to the house and into his bed. Dr. Harrison showed up 4 hours later. He looked at the leg and then he gave her the news she had been dreading. "The break is severe. I can set it, but I cannot guarantee it will heal right. In the best case, he is looking at months of recovery. In the worst case," the doctor did not finish his sentence. He did not have to. Eliza stood in the hallway outside Caleb's room while the doctor worked, listening to the sounds of pain that Caleb could not completely hold back, even with the laudanum the doctor had given him. In her 23 years, she had seen her share of hardship, from being orphaned to losing her home and facing impossible choices. But this felt different. This was watching a man she loved hurt, and she was completely helpless to do a thing about it. When Dr. Harrison finally came out, his face was a grim mask. "The leg is set. I did everything I could. Now it is up to him, and it is up to you. He's going to need constant watching for the next few weeks. That bone has to mend perfectly straight, which means you have to keep him from moving even when every part of him wants to. That wound needs a daily cleaning to keep the infection out, and you have to keep his strength up, which will not be easy with him being in so much pain. I can do all that, Eliza said, her voice steady. It is not going to be a walk in the park. You are already running a whole ranch, and now you are going to play nurse on top of it all. I do not care how hard it is. Just tell me what I need to do. The doctor left her with clear instructions and enough laudanum to last them the week. After his horse disappeared into the growing darkness, Eliza just stood in the yard and let herself tremble for one single minute. Then, she pulled her shoulders back and marched right back inside. Caleb was awake, looking pale and sweaty, his leg locked in place with the splints the doctor had made. "Eliza," he whispered, "do not talk. You need to save your strength. I have to tell you, the cattle. Jesse cannot handle them all by himself. And Willow needs, I will take care of it. All of it. Jesse and I can manage the ranch. You just worry about getting better." A partnership means when one of us cannot pull their weight, the other one picks up the slack. Right now, that is my job. So you are going to lie there, heal up, and not worry about a single thing except getting back on your feet. Caleb tried to protest, but the pain and pure exhaustion took him under before he could even get the words out. The weeks that followed were the toughest of Eliza's entire life. She and Jesse split all the ranch chores, taking on Caleb's work on top of their own. Their days began before the sun came up and did not end until long after it went down. In between all of that, Eliza took care of Caleb. She cleaned his wound, changed out the bandages, and made him eat even when the pain stole his hunger. She kept him still when his body screamed to move. She barely slept, usually just nodding off in the chair next to his bed, waking with a start at any noise that suggested he might need her. Jesse truly stepped up, working far more hours than he was paid for and never once complaining, even when the work felt downright impossible. Caleb was the worst kind of patient. He hated being stuck in bed, grew angry at his own weakness, and felt frustrated being dependent on others when he was always the one everyone else relied on. "I ought to be out there," he said one afternoon. He tried to sit up, but turned white as a sheet from the pain. "You ought to be healing," Eliza said, gently pushing him back down. "The ranch is doing just fine. Jesse is doing a fine job. Everything is handled. You are worn slap out. I can see it in your eyes. I have been tired before. I will be all right." "This is not what I wanted," Caleb said, his voice full of bitterness. "You having to nurse me like I am an old man while all the ranch work piles up on you. What you want does not really matter right now. What you need is what matters." Eliza sat on the side of the bed, being careful not to bump his leg. "Caleb, do you remember what you said to me after I lost the foal? You said that sometimes, even when you do everything right, it is still not enough. It does not mean you failed. It just means you are dealing with things you cannot control in a world you cannot predict. That is different. It is exactly the same thing. You were thrown from your horse. It was not your fault. It was not something you could have stopped. Now you are doing everything right by following the doctor's orders, resting and healing. That is all anyone can ask of you." He shut his eyes. "I am supposed to be your partner, an equal. Right now, I am nothing but a weight around your neck. You are not a burden. You are someone I—" She stopped, the words getting stuck in her throat. Caleb's eyes opened and met hers. "Someone you what?" Eliza took a deep breath. This was not at all how she pictured this conversation going. She always thought there would be a right moment, maybe someplace romantic, with time to think about what to say. But life does not give you perfect moments. It gives you this: the man she loved, laid up and hurting in bed. Both of them bone-tired. The ranch just barely hanging on around them. And maybe that was perfect in its own way, because this was real. Real love does not happen when things are easy. It happens right in the middle of the struggle. "Someone I love," Eliza said softly. 3 days before your accident, you asked if I would ever consider marrying you. I did not give you an answer because I was afraid. I was scared of needing somebody. I was scared of depending on anybody. I was scared of what might happen if I handed you my heart and you broke it. Eliza, just let me finish. These past few weeks, Watching you in so much pain, I realized I'm already in this with everything I have. I already need you, I already depend on you, and I already love you so much the thought of losing you makes it hard to catch my breath. Being scared of getting hurt does not change a single bit of that. It just means I am wasting precious time we could be using to build a life together. Tears were now running down her face, but she did not even care. So yes, she went on. Yes, I will marry you, if you are still asking, if you still want me after all these weeks of me being bossy and a pretty terrible nurse. Caleb reached up with his good hand and pulled her down for a kiss. It was clumsy and perfect, and tasted of tears and hope and the feeling of coming home. Yes, the offer is still open, he said when they finally pulled apart. And I still want you. I will always want you. Even though I am a terrible cook, even if we might have to hire someone for that one day. Eliza laughed through her tears, and Caleb kissed her again. And right there in that moment, all the fear and the weariness and the worry just melted away into something simpler and truer. It was a love chosen on purpose, built on a partnership and respect, and the kind of trust that can only be earned by going through hard times side by side. They got married quietly in March, with Jesse and Dr. Harrison as their only witnesses right there in the parlor of the ranch house. Caleb was still on crutches. His leg was healing, but it was not yet strong enough to walk on without help. Eliza wore her mother's wedding dress, which she had altered to fit her. The ceremony was short, and the celebration was small, but when Caleb slid that simple gold ring onto her finger, Eliza felt like she was the richest woman in the whole territory. Partners, Caleb said quietly, just like the words they had spoken when they signed their business papers all those months ago. Partners, Eliza agreed, in everything. That night, lying next to her husband in the room that had been just hers for so long, Eliza thought about how much had changed since that desperate day in October. She had been so sure back then that she had to do everything by herself, that accepting help was a sign of weakness, and that relying on anyone would only lead to getting hurt. How wrong she had been. The ranch was now theirs, in name and in spirit. The cattle business was growing. The horses were doing well, with Starlight turning into the exact kind of horse her father had always dreamed of raising. And somewhere in the middle of all that practical success, she had found something so much more precious. A partner who saw her as his equal, who loved her not in spite of her strength, but because of it. A man who had proven over and over again that some people were worth trusting with your entire heart. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb asked, his voice sleepy. "That I am happy," Eliza said, plain and simple. "For the first time since my parents passed away, I am truly, completely happy." Caleb pulled her in closer, being careful with his healing leg. "Good, because this is only the beginning." And lying there in the quiet darkness, listening to the steady sound of her husband's breathing, Eliza believed him. It was the beginning of something that was built to last. Spring showed up with the kind of sudden, beautiful explosion that made the long, hard winter feel like a distant dream. The hills turned a deep green almost overnight, and wildflowers painted the land in colors so bright they hardly looked real. The cattle got fat on the fresh grass, and the horses galloped in the pastures, clearly happy to be free from being cooped up all winter. Caleb's leg mended, slow but sure. By April, he had moved on from crutches to a cane, and by May, he had tossed that aside too, though he walked with a slight limp that Dr. Harrison said might just be permanent. Eliza would sometimes find him standing by the fence, just looking out over their land, his hand unconsciously rubbing the leg that had nearly cost him everything. "Does it hurt?" she asked one evening, coming up to stand next to him. "Sometimes. Mostly it just reminds me how lucky I am." He turned to face her. His look was serious. "I could have lost the leg completely. I could have died from an infection. Instead, I am standing right here with my wife, watching our cattle graze on our land. It is hard to complain about a limp when what could have happened was so much worse. Their land, their cattle, their life together." Those words still gave Eliza a little thrill of pride and ownership. Jesse had stayed on through the winter and into the spring, proving he was worth his weight in gold. He had grown from a skinny 19-year-old kid into a capable ranch hand who had his own ideas about managing cattle and the confidence to say them with respect. Caleb had started teaching him the finer details of selecting breeding stock, and Eliza had him helping out with the horses. One afternoon in late May, Jesse came up to them both, holding his hat in his hands with a look on his face that said he had something difficult to say. "What is on your mind?" Caleb asked. "I got an offer," Jesse said. "Jack Morrison wants me to come work for him. It could be a permanent foreman job down the line. It is good pay, and a chance to learn the business from the bottom up." Eliza's heart sank a little. They had really come to count on Jesse, and more than that, she had grown to like him a lot. Losing him would mean they would have to scramble to find new help or go back to just the two of them trying to manage it all. But Caleb surprised her. "That is a fine opportunity," he said. "Morrison runs a good operation. You would learn a whole lot over there." "I would hate to leave y'all in a bind, though," Jesse said, his eyes shifting between them. "You have been mighty good to me, taught me more than I can say. It just feels wrong to up and leave. It is not wrong to take a better chance when it comes along," Eliza said, though it pained her some to say it. "When do they want you to start?" "Morrison is looking for me in 2 weeks. But if y'all need more time to find a replacement, 2 weeks is fine," Jesse said with a firm nod. "We will make do. And Jesse, you earned this opportunity. Do not you feel one bit guilty about moving on up." After Jesse rode out, Eliza turned to her husband. "We cannot handle this all on our own, not with the bigger herd and all the horses. I know, but we cannot hold Jesse back just because we need him. That would not be right. So what are we fixin' to do?" Caleb stood quiet for a moment, thinking. "We will hire 2 people. Not one man doing everything, but 2 specialists. We need someone who knows cattle from hoof to horn, and another who has a real gift with horses. It is time we built a proper crew instead of running one fella ragged. It was a smart plan, though it meant more money spent on wages. But the ranch was turning a good profit now. The horse sales had stayed strong all through the winter, and the cattle business was really starting to take off. They could afford to bring in good, skilled hands. Over the next week, they sent word all across the territory that they were hiring. The number of folks who answered surprised them both. It turned out the Hartley Mercer Ranch had earned itself a name as a fine place to work, run by fair people who paid well and treated their workers with respect. They talked to 5 different men for the cattle job and decided on a weathered old cowboy named Tom Briggs. He had worked on outfits from Texas clean up to Montana and knew breedin' stock the way a preacher knows the good book. For the horse position, they came face to face with someone they never expected. Her name was Sarah Reeves. She was 42 years old, lean as a whip with calloused hands and eyes that sized up a horse with the same sharp look Eliza's own father used to have. She had been the head stablemaster for a rich family back in Kentucky before making her way west, and she knew about bloodlines and training methods that Eliza had only ever read about in books. "I am going to be honest with you," Sarah said, sitting across from them in the ranch house. "Most men will not hire a woman to do this kind of work. They figure I cannot handle the tough stuff or that I will just cause trouble. But I am the best horse trainer you will find anywhere in this territory. I do not much care about the pay as long as it is fair and I get to work with good quality animals." Eliza glanced over at Caleb. She saw the question in his eyes and she gave him a slow nod. "You are hired," Caleb said. "You will get the same wages as Briggs, a room in the new bunkhouse we are building, and a share in any horse you train yourself if it sells for more than a certain price." Sarah's eyes went wide. "A share?" "We believe in paying folks for good work," Eliza explained. "My father always said the best way to make people care about quality is to give them a personal stake in how things turn out. You make our horses better, you get a piece of the profit. It just seems fair to us." "That is more than fair," Sarah said, her voice a little rough with feeling. "When do I start?" They all settled into a new way of doing things with the bigger crew. Tom took charge of the cattle, setting up new grazing patterns and breeding plans that made the whole herd better. In just a few months, Sarah was working pure magic with the horses. She took the good foundation Eliza had built and added her own skills, producing animals so fine that buyers started coming from 3 territories away just to see them. And through it all, Caleb and Eliza were learning how to be partners in business and partners in life. It was not always easy. They had their disagreements about money, about what needed doing first, about whose ideas should lead the way on certain things. But they had started a good habit early on of talking through their problems instead of letting them boil over. They remembered they were on the same team, even when they did not see eye to eye on how to play the game. Then, in July, Eliza figured out she was pregnant. She had thought so for a few weeks, but kept it to herself, wanting to be sure before she got anyone's hopes up or caused any worry. When Dr. Harrison confirmed it, she sat in the wagon on the ride home trying to sort out her feelings. She was excited, for sure, but she was also scared down to her bones. Her own mother had died of a broken heart, but she had also lost 3 babies between the time Eliza was born and her father passed away. Having a baby was dangerous, and birthing one was even more so. Caleb was out mending a fence when she got back to the ranch. She walked out to where he was working, her heart thumping in her chest. "I need to tell you something," she said. He looked up right away, his face full of concern. "What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong, at least I do not think so. I am going to have a baby." Caleb let the hammer fall from his hand. For a second he just stared at her, and she could not read his face at all. Then he was moving, crossing the space between them, and pulling her into his arms with a gentleness that made her throat feel tight. "Are you happy about it?" he asked, his voice soft against her hair. "I do not know," Eliza admitted. "I am scared. My mother. You are not your mother. And you are strong, Eliza. You are stronger than any person I've ever known. Women die having babies. Strong women, healthy women. But many more live right through it and have healthy babies." He pulled back so he could look her in the eyes. "We will get you the best care. Dr. Harrison will keep a close watch on everything, and I will be there with you every single step. You cannot be in the room with me during the birth. That is not how it is done. Then I will be planted right outside the door, close enough to hear you curse my name for getting you into this mess in the first place." In spite of all her fear, Eliza had to laugh. "I might just do that anyway." The pregnancy went along just fine through the summer and into the fall. Eliza kept on working as long as she was able, though Caleb and Sarah schemed together to keep her from doing any of the real heavy lifting. By October, exactly 1 year since Caleb had first ridden up to her ranch, she was getting too big to do much more than light chores and supervising. One afternoon, she and Caleb sat together on the porch, watching the sun go down over a piece of land that had been completely transformed in just 12 months. The cattle were grazing peacefully out in the distance. The horses were running in pastures with brand-new fencing. The ranch house itself had been added onto again, this time to make proper bedrooms for the growing family they were building together. "Do you remember this day last year?" Eliza asked. "I remember every last detail. You were standing on this porch watching those bank fellas take stock of your entire life. I remember the look on your face when I paid off your debt, like you could not decide if I was a crazy man or if you were just dreaming." "I definitely thought you were crazy," Eliza admitted. "Paying $2,300 for someone you had never even had a conversation with. It was the best money I ever spent." "You did not know that at the time." "I knew enough." He took her hand, fitting his fingers between hers. "I knew you were the kind of person who would fight for what was important. That was a chance worth taking." Vernon Hastings had come by the ranch one time in the early summer, claiming he was just checking on the property's value for the bank records. Eliza figured he was really there to see if they had gone belly up yet. What he found instead was a place that was humming right along with healthy animals, good folks working there, and improvements that had made the land worth a whole lot more. "You have done well," he had said, and he could not quite cover up how let down he was. "We have done well," Eliza corrected him, making sure he heard the we. "My husband and I." She got a special kind of satisfaction watching him ride off, knowing he had to go tell his bosses that the Hartley Mercer Ranch was not just getting by, but actually turning a fine profit. A small, mean part of her hoped that news stung him a little. In December, as the first anniversary of Sage's tough birth was coming up, Eliza went into labor. It was late in the afternoon, with the winter sun already dipping low, when the first pains started. Caleb sent Tom riding like the devil was on his tail to go get Dr. Harrison, and to get Sarah to come stay with Eliza. Meanwhile, Caleb paced around the house like a trapped bobcat. The labor was a long one, almost 20 hours, but it was not a difficult one. Dr. Harrison watched over everything like a hawk, and Sarah stayed right by Eliza's side. She gave the kind of steady, common-sense help that did more good than a bunch of empty reassurances ever could have. When the baby finally made his appearance, squalling and absolutely perfect, Dr. Harrison laid the little one in Eliza's arms and said, "You have a son, and by the sound of those lungs, he is as healthy as a young colt." Caleb was allowed to come in then, and the look on his face when he laid eyes on his son for the first time was something Eliza knew she would carry with her forever. It was a mix of pure wonder, deep fear, and a love so big it filled the room. "He is perfect," Caleb whispered, touching one little bitty hand with a finger that looked impossibly huge next to it. "We did good work," Eliza said, worn clean out but feeling on top of the world. "You did the hardest part. We will call it even." They named him Samuel, after Caleb's father. Samuel Mercer was born on December 20th, 1887, on a ranch that had nearly been lost to them, but had instead become the rock on which they built something that would last. The months after Samuel was born were a whirlwind of sleepless nights and learning things the hard way. Eliza had always thought she knew what hard work was, but taking care of a baby while her own body was still mending put her to the test in ways she had never imagined. Caleb was as involved as a man could be in those days. He would walk the floors with a fussy baby at 3 in the morning, change diapers without a single complaint, and take over the night feedings when Eliza was just too tired to keep her eyes open. Sarah turned out to be a surprising blessing, having raised her own younger brothers and sisters back in Kentucky. She showed Eliza little tricks for calming a crying baby and how to handle the impossible juggling act of running a ranch and being a new mother. By the time spring rolled around, they had finally found their rhythm. Samuel was sleeping through the night more often than not. Eliza was back to working on the ranch at least part of the day, and things were running so smoothly they could sometimes take a day for themselves without the whole place falling to pieces. One afternoon in May, Caleb walked into the house and found Eliza nursing Samuel in the rocking chair her father had made for her mother. "I have some news," he said. "Good or bad?" "Good, real good. I just sold 3 yearlings to a fella from California. He is starting a breeding program out there and wants our bloodline to be his foundation." "How much?" Eliza asked, though she could already see the answer written all over Caleb's face. "Enough to pay off the last of what we spent on expanding and put a good chunk in savings. We are completely in the clear, Eliza. No debt, a healthy bit set aside, and orders coming in faster than we can fill them." She knew they were doing well, but hearing him say it so plainly made it feel real in a way it had not before. They had actually done it. They had taken a ranch on the brink of failure and turned it into a booming success in less than 2 years. "My father would be proud," she said, her voice soft. "He would be in awe of you. You took what he started and made it better than he probably ever dreamed." "We did," Eliza corrected him again. "I could not have done any of this without you." Caleb sat down in the chair across from her. "Remember when you were so scared of depending on anybody? Thought it made you weak. I was a fool. You were scared. There is a difference," he said gently. He paused for a moment. "But just look at what we built, because you were willing to trust someone. Not just the ranch, though that is impressive enough. But this," he said, waving his hand to include everything around them. "A family, a home, a life that neither one of us could have made on our own." He was right. Every good thing in Eliza's life had grown from that one terrifying choice to accept help, to become a partner, to trust somebody else with her dreams and her future. In June, Sarah came to them with news of her own. She and Tom Briggs had been courting, something everybody on the ranch had seen but had been polite enough to not mention, and they wanted to get married. "I will understand if you want to let one of us go," Sarah said. "Having a married couple on the payroll can make things complicated." "Why on earth would we let either of you go?" Caleb asked, looking genuinely confused. "You are both the best at what you do. What y'all do in your own time is your own business." They got married in July, a simple little ceremony right there at the ranch, and Caleb and Eliza gave them the brand new cabin as a wedding present. Having two married couples managing the ranch changed how things felt again, but all in good ways. Tom and Sarah brought a kind of stability and long-term commitment that you just never got from single ranch hands. The years that came after were filled with the usual mix of victories and struggles that make up a life on a ranch. There were good years when cattle prices were high and the horses sold like hotcakes, and there were lean years when a drought or a bad market tested just how tough they were. They lost animals to sickness and bad luck. They celebrated new births, and they mourned when things passed on. Samuel grew from a baby to a toddler, then to a little boy who followed his father around the ranch like a second shadow, already learning the work that would one day be his. When he was 3, Eliza gave birth to a daughter they named Grace, for the amazing grace that had seen them through it all. Grace was the opposite of Samuel. Where he was serious and steady, she was wild and had no fear. She was always climbing things she should not and was riding horses before she could hardly walk right. She reminded Eliza so much of her own mother it sometimes hurt, that same powerful spirit that refused to be fenced in by what people thought she should be. By the time a whole decade had passed since that October day when Caleb rode in to save her ranch, Eliza sometimes had to just stop and shake her head at how completely her life had turned around. The Hartley Mercer Ranch was known across 3 territories as the best place to get working horses with real grit and smarts. Their cattle business, while not as big as some, was making good money and growing every year. They had bought the land next to theirs when it went up for sale, giving them more room for grazing. They had built a proper bunkhouse for the hands they hired on for busy seasons, a separate barn just for the breeding horses, and a little schoolhouse for the children that other ranch families in the area used too. But more than all the buildings and land, Eliza cherished the life they had built inside of it all. Samuel, now 10 years old, was already showing he had his father's steady patience and his mother's natural way with horses. Grace, who was 7, could outride kids twice her age and had opinions about breeding cattle that sometimes made Tom bust out laughing in surprise. One evening in late October of 1896, Eliza and Caleb sat on the porch, just like they had done hundreds of times before. The children were tucked in bed asleep. The ranch was quiet except for the usual nighttime sounds of animals settling down and the wind whispering through the tall grass. 10 years, Eliza said quietly. Almost to the day, Caleb agreed. October 15th was the day the bank was going to take it all. I can hardly remember being that terrified woman standing right here on this porch watching those bankmen take count of everything I owned. I remember her, Caleb said. She was magnificent, scared spitless but not broken. That is what made me so sure. Sure of what? That you were worth saving. That this ranch was worth saving. That betting everything I had on a complete stranger was the smartest gamble I would ever take. Eliza leaned her head against her husband's shoulder, feeling a sense of comfort she never thought she would find with another person. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had not shown up that day? Sometimes. You would have lost the ranch, probably ended up with a job in town somewhere. Maybe you would have eventually married someone safe and boring. And you, she said. You would have kept looking for land and probably found some, but it would not have been this. It would not have been all you. We just got lucky, Eliza said. No, we were brave, Caleb told her. Luck is when something just falls right into your lap. Being brave is when you're willing to risk it all for something that truly matters. And we both did that. You took a chance on me as a partner, and I took a chance offering it. The rest of that was just plain old hard work. And he was right, just like he usually was. Maybe luck brought him to her ranch that one day, but everything that came after was a choice, a promise, and a stubborn refusal to give up. The door creaked open and Samuel walked in, rubbing the sleep out of his eyes. "Mama, I dreamed about grandfather, the one who built this whole place." A lump formed in Eliza's throat. Samuel had never laid eyes on his grandfather, but they told stories about him all the time, making sure his memory stayed alive. "What did you dream, honey?" she asked. "He told me to tell you he's proud of you. That you took his dream and made it even bigger and better than he ever imagined." Samuel yawned. "Is that silly?" "No, sweetheart," Eliza said, with tears welling up in her eyes. "That is not silly at all." After Samuel was tucked back in his bed, Caleb found Eliza in her father's old study. She was looking at the breeding records that went back 30 years. Her daddy's handwriting filled up the first pages. Then her own writing took over in the middle, and now Caleb's notes were showing up regular like too. "Your father really would be proud," Caleb said, leaning against the doorframe. "I know. I just wish he could see it all. Wish he could meet his grandkids. Wish he knew that everything he built wasn't lost." "Well, maybe he can. Who's to say what's possible?" Caleb came and stood right there beside her. "But even if he can't, his legacy is right here in these books, in those fine horses, and in our children who will keep it all going. That's a kind of living forever, ain't it?" Eliza gently closed the heavy record book. "When Samuel gets old enough, he needs to learn how to keep these records, to keep the tradition alive. And Grace, too. Grace as well. That girl has a mind for cattle that we can't let go to waste just 'cause she's a girl. They'll both learn everything we can teach them, and then they can decide for themselves what parts they want to take on." "Your father would have liked that too," Caleb said. "After all, he raised you to run this outfit." They walked back to their bedroom, the whole house settled and quiet around them. Eliza thought about how much this room had changed. It had been her parents' room, then just hers after they passed, and then theirs together after she and Caleb got married. Now it was the very heart of a home that held not just them, but their children, their ranch hands who were more like family, and all the dreams they had turned into solid ground. The next morning, Eliza woke up and saw Caleb was already awake, just standing at the window looking out over the ranch. She went over to him, wrapping her arms around his middle from behind. Together they watched the sun come up over the land they had fought so hard to keep. "What are you thinking about?" she asked him. "That I'm grateful for every bit of it, the good years and the tough ones, the wins and the losses, every single moment that got us to right here, even the broken leg, even that, because it taught us we could get through a crisis together, that we could take care of each other when it counted most." Samuel showed up at their door with Grace trailing right behind him. Both kids were ready for breakfast and whatever adventures the day would bring. Eliza and Caleb shared a look that held 10 years of partnership, of a love that had been tested and proven true, of dreams they built together from nothing but faith and pure grit. They all went downstairs as a family. Eliza got breakfast going while Caleb got the children started on their morning chores. Out the window, she could see Tom and Sarah heading for the barn. She could see the cattle grazing way out in the distance, and the horses running in pastures her own father had fenced up decades ago. This was her life now. It might not have been the one she expected, but it was 1,000 times better than anything she could have ever planned. She had lost everything one time, her parents, her security, the idea that just working hard was always enough. And in losing all that, she found something worth so much more. She had found a partner, love, a family, and a future built on trust instead of fear. Later that morning, after the breakfast dishes were cleared away and the children were busy with their lessons, Caleb found Eliza in the barn. She was checking on a mare that was about to foal. "I was thinking," he said, "maybe it's time we make this official." "Make what official?" "The name of this ranch. We've been calling it the Hartley Mercer Ranch for a while now, but the deed still just says Hartley. We should probably get that changed. Make it clear this place belongs to both of us." Eliza thought about it. Her father's name on that deed was the last official piece of him she had. The final proof that this was his dream first. But just holding on to the past wasn't how you honored it. Building on it was. "Yes," she said, "let's do that. The Hartley Mercer Ranch, official and legal." They rode into town the very next week and filed all the paperwork. The clerk at the courthouse hardly batted an eye. Everybody in the whole territory already knew them as the Hartley Mercer operation anyway. but seen it written down for real, both their names claiming. Making the ownership equal felt like finally closing an old book and starting a new one. Riding back to the ranch, Caleb spoke up. You know, there is something I have never done. What is that? Thank you the right way. For what exactly? For saying you would. For betting on a man you did not know from Adam. For making this life with me even when you were scared spitless. I ought to be the one thanking you, Eliza countered. You saved every bit of this place. We saved each other, Caleb cut in. You gave me a piece of the world to call my own. A reason to get up in the morning besides just getting by and stacking up money. A family that means more to me than any amount of cash I ever paid. They rode on for a spell in that easy quiet that comes between old friends. The autumn sun felt good on their skin, and the land around them was as familiar as their own faces. Caleb, Eliza said after a while. Yeah, I am mighty glad you showed up that day. I am glad you were just reckless enough to clear a stranger's slate. I am glad for all of it. This partnership, this marriage, our kids, the life we have made. Every last piece, even when I'm about to drive you crazy. Especially then, it just proves you care enough to get riled up. He let out a laugh, and the sound of it settled in Eliza's heart with a peace so deep it nearly took her breath away. This was what her daddy had wanted for her all along, she knew then. Not just a ranch that turned a profit, but a life that was full to the brim. With love and family, and a real purpose. She had found it all, and then some. As their horses topped the final rise, the ranch lay before them, showing off all its hard-won glory. The house her father built was bigger now, making room for a family that was still growing. The barns, the corrals, and the pastures had all been improved and kept up with a careful hand. The cattle and horses were the result of years of smart breeding and hard work. And there in the yard, waiting on them to come home, were two children who were the future of it all. Samuel lifted his hand and waved the second he saw them, and Grace took off running for the road, kicking up dust and not caring one bit that her mama would surely have something to say about her wild streak. Our daughter does not have a lick of fear in her, Caleb remarked. She gets that from you. Me? I am careful as they come. You paid $2,300 for a man you had never laid eyes on. That is not what I call careful. That was not about being fearless. It was about being sure. I knew what had to be done, so I went and did it. Eliza mulled that over as they covered the last stretch home. Maybe that was the real lesson she had learned over these 10 years. It was not that fear was not real, or that it did not matter, but that being sure about what was important could help you walk right through it. She had been terrified the day she took Caleb on as a partner. Terrified when she agreed to be his wife. Terrified with every baby born, every loss, and every tight spot they had faced down. But running deep underneath all that fear was a certainty. A certainty that this partnership was worth fighting for, that this love was worth protecting, and that the life they were building was worth every ounce of courage she could find. They swung down from their saddles in the yard, and Grace barreled right into Eliza's legs with all the force a 7-year-old can bring. Mama, you have got to come see. The mare had her baby. Which mare? Eliza asked, though her heart was already pounding. They had 3 that were due any day now. The one Papa said was special, the granddaughter of Ranger. Eliza and Caleb just looked at each other and then hurried toward the barn. And there, in the clean stall they had ready, stood a mare with a brand-new filly at her side. And that filly, well, that filly was a picture. She had Ranger's strong build, her mama's smart eyes, and a coat that seemed to shine even in the barn's dim light. She is the one, Eliza whispered, knowing deep down, without a single doubt, that this was the horse that would carry their name to a whole new level. Papa would have purely loved her. What are we going to name her? Samuel asked, suddenly right there at Eliza's side. Eliza looked at that new filly, then at her children, at her husband, and at the barn her father had raised and she had expanded. She looked at this life that had nearly been lost for good but was saved and turned into something more than either she or her father could have ever dreamed up on their own. Hope, she said. We will call her Hope. Because that is what this whole long road has been about, when you get right down to it. Hope that putting in the work would finally pay. Hope that you could actually trust another person. Hope that love was a risk worth taking. Hope that what was broken could be fixed, what was lost could be found, and what seemed flat out impossible could be done when you had a partner, a strong back, and a little bit of faith. That night, long after the children were tucked in and a hush had fallen over the ranch, Eliza and Caleb sat out on the porch again. The stars were scattered like diamonds across the black sky, and the air had a crisp feel that promised winter was on its way. The whole world around them felt peaceful. 10 years ago today, Caleb said, I rode up to this place a stranger and turned both our lives upside down. Best thing that ever happened to either one of us, Eliza said. I would do it all over again, Caleb said. Every last bit of it. Every hard decision. Every crisis. Every single moment of doubt. Because it all led me right here, to this porch, to this life, to you, to everything that matters. Eliza reached for his hand, weaving her fingers through his like she had done 1,000 times. You did more than just pay off a debt that day, you know. You gave us a future, the both of us, and we put it together piece by piece until it was something neither one of us could have ever made by ourselves. That is what a partnership is, Caleb said quietly. That is what love is. Two people making something grander than either one could on their own. They sat there in the dark, holding hands, looking out at their land, living inside the life they had fought so hard for. Somewhere inside the house, their children were sleeping safe and sound. Out in the barn, Hope, the little filly that stood for everything they had accomplished, was nursing from her mother. All across the ranch, the hands they employed were resting, knowing that tomorrow would bring another day of honest work and fair pay. This was what real success felt like, Eliza thought. It was not just about having money in the bank or a thriving operation, though those things surely helped. It was about this partnership, this family, this purpose, this feeling of belonging. It was knowing you had taken something that was shattered and made it whole again, that you had risked it all and won not just your security, but your joy. The dust storm that had blown through these plains 10 years ago had carried away the woman Eliza used to be, scared, all alone and desperate. In her place was someone stronger, someone who had learned that being vulnerable was not the same as being weak, and that asking for help can sometimes be the bravest thing a person can do. She had needed saving that October day, and Caleb had been the one to do it, but he had needed saving too, from a life of nothing but work with no meaning, from the ache of not having a place to call home, from the empty feeling of winning goals that did not matter. They had saved each other, and by doing that they had built something that would live on long after they were gone. A ranch, a family, a legacy of partnership and of love. I love you, Eliza said into the quiet night. I love you too, Caleb answered back, now and for always. And sitting there on the porch of the house they had built with their own two hands, surrounded by everything they had battled for and won, Eliza knew for certain that this life, this love, this partnership was exactly what her father had dreamed of when he first drove a stake into this ground all those years ago. It was more than just surviving. It was about truly living. More than just enduring. It was about finding joy. More than just a ranch. It was a home. They had taken his dream and made it bigger, made it better, made it theirs. And one day, they would hand it down to their children, who would add their own dreams to the foundation, building something that would stand for generations to come. The cowboy had arrived on the very day they were seizing her ranch. He had paid every last cent she owed and sent those men packing. But he did more, so much more than that. He stayed. He became her partner. He loved her. He built alongside her. And together, they forged a future that was worth every sacrifice, every struggle, and every moment of fear. This was their story. This was their victory. This right here was home. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.